Hello, everyone. Omni-sensei here with What If I Was Reborn as Jon Snow the God Emperor? Game of Thrones. Part 5. If you enjoy this kind of content, please smash the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Don't forget to check out the original story linked in the description. I hope you enjoy listening to it. I am benevolent. I always kill in the most painless way. Aenar Targaryen to Olenna Tyrell. With incredible agility and speed, a flock of small, thrasher-like birds, gray with black feathers, flew in perfect harmony across the vastness of the blue sky. Free and peaceful, the group seemed immune to worry, almost as if they were the sovereigns of the skies. If it were an ordinary world, perhaps they would be. But this was no ordinary world. As they passed close to an enormous white cloud, which looked more like heavenly cotton candy, a gigantic mouth emerged from the depths of the cloud, cruelly devouring a large number of the birds. In an instant, the rest panicked, scattering in all directions, trying to escape the invisible terror. The next moment, the source of that mouth was revealed. A colossal winged creature emerged from the cloud, tearing the sky apart with its imposing presence. Crimson scales covered its muscular, slender body. It was a being the size of a hill, whose existence defied all the laws of physics. But in a world where magic reigned, even universal rules could be subverted. Aenar, mounted on Caraxes, looked out over the rapidly approaching continent. A satisfied smile crossed his face. Although Essos had become the center of his power, deep down Westeros would always be his true home. Looking at the tense figure sitting in front of him in the saddle, Aenar couldn't help but be amused. Leda, with her usual cool and calm expression, exuded a subtle nervousness. Despite her rigid posture, the slight trembling of her body betrayed her. The girl was trying very hard not to show how much the situation was bothering her. "You seem to be enjoying it, Leda," teased Aenar with a mischievous smile, leaning over to whisper in her ear. "Don't worry, whenever I fly, I'll take you with me." Leda finally broke her mask of indifference. Her eyes glanced behind her, where she saw the teasing smile on the face of her king and cousin. She knew he was teasing her, yet the idea of flying often didn't appeal to her in the slightest. How humans could feel comfortable riding such a gigantic creature was something she couldn't understand. However, as Lady Commander of the Kingsguard, the king's requests were absolute. "If your grace wishes, it shall be done." Leda replied with the cold, controlled tone that was her trademark. Aenar rolled his eyes, frustrated by the predictable answer. He should have brought Daenerys with him, he thought to himself. At least she knew how to have fun. Leda, on the other hand, was incredibly similar to her father. They were both too serious, almost incapable of appreciating the smallest provocations or the most relaxed moments. Then on the horizon, an iconic sight came into view. A vast city and a red fortress rising above it would catch anyone's eye. King's Landing, capital of the Seven Kingdoms. His choice of route to the Reach was strategic. Aenar could have gone through Storm's End or Dorne, but passing through the Crownlands was the most direct route and, more importantly, the one that would provide him with the perfect opportunity to show off his power. Being seen in King's Landing, mounted on Caraxes, would mark the arrival of the new king in an unforgettable way. "Let's put on a show for the people of this city, Caraxes," murmured Aenar to the dragon, who responded with a deep trill, as if he shared the king's excitement. Aenar couldn't help but smile when he thought of the advantage of possessing an ability like prescience. Being able to glimpse into the past and later witness Robert and Tywin's expressions of dread and despair when they saw Caraxes for the first time was something he knew he would love. The show was about to begin. Robert was relaxing with his family, a habit he had developed since learning of the existence of Prince Targaryen and his dragon. The thought of facing such a threat brought with it the realization that his chances of survival in the future were uncertain, perhaps even minimal. That's why he began to value these simple moments with his children. Of course, with the exception of Joffrey. Watching Myrcella and Tommen play knight and princess, Robert's lips curved into a genuine smile. He had never thought he could find so much satisfaction in something so mundane. These little moments of tranquility were a way of escaping the cruel reality that hung over him. But the image of Prince Targaryen riding his dragon soon brought him back to the harsh truth. A storm was approaching, and he needed to be prepared. Many thought that the marriage to House Stark was supposed to be just a political move to consolidate an alliance, but in fact it was something more calculated and darker. It was Robert's way of trying to ensure that his children would survive if he died and the Baratheon dynasty was destroyed. Robert was betting that the Targaryen prince, as much as he might hate him, would hesitate to take Myrcella and Tommen's lives if they were linked to his maternal family, House Stark. An attempt to appeal to ties of blood and honor, however tenuous. Yes, Robert knew it was monumentally hypocritical of him to think so. After all, he had laughed and celebrated in front of the dead bodies of Elia Martell, Rhaenys and Aegon, Rhaegar's wife and children. But even aware of his hypocrisy, he clung to this faint hope. He wanted, above all, to believe that Myrcella and Tommen could have a future, even if it was a future marked by the defeat of the Baratheons. "Father, I made this crown for you." Myrcella's sweet voice interrupted Robert's thoughts, and he couldn't help but smile. He looked at the small wreath his daughter was holding, and with an indulgent gesture, bowed his head. Myrcella, excited, smiled innocently and placed the wreath on her father's hair. "The great King Robert Baratheon," she exclaimed with a tone full of pride, as if she were declaring it to the whole world. Robert blinked in surprise. Him, a great king? He certainly knew what they called him behind his back. Usurper, fat king, dirty king, silly king. Humiliating titles, but they had never called him great king. Not even on his best days. Still, hearing those words come out of his daughter's innocent mouth warmed something in his heart. For the first time in a long time, he felt a shred of genuine happiness. He let out a deep laugh and stroked Myrcella's golden hair. Her radiant smile as she received his caresses made the moment seem perfect. But Robert couldn't help noticing something. The girl bore no resemblance to him. Nothing. Not the features, not the eyes, not the smile. This had been bothering him for years, and the seed of doubt grew in his mind again. Was it paranoia? Or worse, a truth he was afraid to face? Before he could delve deeper into these thoughts, something interrupted the calm. The sky abruptly darkened. A deafening, reverberating sound echoed throughout King's Landing. Robert looked up at the sky, and what he saw made his face turn pale. A dragon. His instinct took over. Without hesitation, he grabbed Myrcella and Tommen in his arms and ran towards the Red Keep. Even if they faced the same fate as Harrenhal, he knew that the thick walls of the fortress would offer some level of protection against the deadly flames of the creature flying over the city. Dragon! Myrcella shouted excitedly, her eyes shining with fascination as she looked up at the sky. To her, it looked like something out of a story. Yes, a dragon. Above King's Landing, a gigantic crimson-scaled dragon hovered, the shadow of its wings covering much of the city. Citizens stood still, staring at the creature with expressions that ranged from terror to fascination. A deadly silence gripped the city for a moment, until the dragon opened its mouth. "Dracarys," Enar commanded in a firm voice. Crimson flames exploded from the dragon's mouth, crossing the sky and covering a third of the sky. Despite the terror in people's hearts, many realized that the flames were not meant for them. Instead, the sky itself seemed to be the target. The spectacle that followed was breathtaking. The dragon broke through the cloud of fire it had created, emerging in a magnificent and terrifying flight. It was more than a show of strength. It was a clear message to everyone in King's Landing. House Targaryen had returned to Westeros once again. The Crimson Dragon flew over King's Landing, releasing scarlet flames that lit up the sky and painted the clouds a fiery red. The spectacle was as frightening as it was majestic. Caraxes flew with surprising grace, despite his enormous size, passing through the curtains of fire that he himself created, as if dancing in the air. Down below, the whole city stopped to watch. The children, in particular, stared at the huge winged being with admiration and fascination, while the adults fought the instinct to flee. However, as the minutes passed, it became clear to everyone that the dragon and its rider had no intention of causing destruction. And everyone knew exactly who they were. The rumors that had been swirling around Westeros for months now hung alive and real in the sky. Enar Targaryen and his legendary Crimson Dragon, Caraxes. "It's a demonstration." Tywin Lannister broke the silence inside the small council chamber, the Lord of the Rock's voice cold and deep. He watched the dragon with an almost inhuman calm, while the others struggled to hide their discomfort. A display of strength and power, he continued, without taking his eyes off the spectacle. Prince Targaryen is announcing his arrival to everyone in Westeros. No subterfuge, no cunning schemes. He wants us to know that he will face anyone head-on. Robert Baratheon, beside him, crossed his arms. The king's gaze was fixed on the dragon dancing among the flames, reflecting a mixture of worry and weariness. He no longer feared for his children's safety at that moment, but the sight of a Targaryen displaying such control and power made his heart heavy. "At least he's not like his grandfather," murmured Renly Baratheon, almost in a whisper. But his words, full of fear, echoed in the silence of the room. All eyes fell on him, many of them full of disapproval. Although it was natural to fear a dragon, the men there knew better than to show weakness. If the situation escalated into a confrontation, they would need a cool head and a quick reaction, and Renly seemed incapable of that. Robert gave his brother a disgruntled look, but decided not to reprimand him. He turned his eyes to the sky, following the dragon's flight. Caraxes released another wave of flames, lighting up the horizon like an anticipated sunset. Then, under the gaze of the whole of King's Landing, the dragon let out one last roar. Its deep, deafening cry reverberated like a warning. And then, with a powerful flick of his wings, Caraxes turned and flew off towards a new destination. Inside the small council room, the expressions of those present changed dramatically as they realized the dragon's route. They knew exactly where Enar Targaryen was heading. The Reach. Robert's face was grim. Don't say marriage. He'd be happy if the Reach didn't agree to join this war. But seeing the size of the dragon, he knew the chances of that happening were extremely slim. A fool could see who had the upper hand in the ensuing civil war. From this moment on, we must buy all the food we can in Essos as quickly as possible. We won't have enough food to sustain our armies. Robert ordered in a calm, majestic tone. Since Enar was declaring war, he would not cower and would fight head-on. Tywin looked at Robert with an appreciative gaze. He finally saw the man of 12 years ago, a powerful and voracious warrior, the demon of the trident. They needed a king like that right now, not a drunken king. If Robert had remained the same man before the rebellion, they would have had a better chance of winning the war, because the people loved their king, making the Targaryen prince's invasion extremely difficult. But that was impossible at the moment. After more than a decade of rule, the people never really liked their king. They wouldn't be sorry even if Robert died the next day. "I thought your grace was going to come down and greet your cousin," Leda commented, with a hint of surprise in her voice. The white cloak over her shoulders was scorched at the edges, a silent testimony to the spectacle of fire that Caraxes had offered over the capital. "Our first meeting will be on the battlefield, a more appropriate place for two monarchs to meet." Enar took a deep breath, trying to calm the turmoil inside him. Only he knew how much he had resisted the temptation to land in King's Landing, to look Robert Baratheon in the eye and confront him right there. But Enar stopped himself. He didn't want to meet Robert in King's Landing. The battlefield would be an appropriate place for him to kill his father's murderer. Leda watched her king carefully. She knew a bloodlust when she saw one. And at that moment, Enar exuded a murderous desire so intense that it was almost visible, something she thought was impossible, but she could vaguely see the air around him moving in an abnormal way. She admired him for it. If it had been her, she would have given in. She wouldn't have bothered with formalities or waited for the ideal moment. Justice would be done immediately, without hesitation. "We'll get to Reach in no time," Enar commented, changing the subject to get his mind off his dark thoughts. An amused smile formed on his lips. "I'm looking forward to seeing the Queen of Thorns' expression." Leda rolled her eyes, annoyed. Her king was good at many things, but his sense of humor was absolutely terrible. Who would care about someone's expressions in a situation like this? As Leda could tell with his gift, Enar rarely had surprises, and in order to prevent himself from becoming an emotionless machine, who only thought about ruling perfectly in order to bring humanity to eternity, he liked to experience his own feelings with surprising intensity. About an hour later, Enar and Leda saw a huge river meandering through the green pastures. Mandar, the largest river in the Seven Kingdoms, and also the source of all the Reach's prosperity. The huge river nourished the soil, making it extremely fertile and perfect for large-scale plantations. It was no wonder that the Reach was the second richest kingdom, second only to the mineral-rich western lands. Because of this wealth in food and money, the Reach had the largest army of the Seven Kingdoms, around 70 to 100,000 men, a truly giant army in medieval terms. "It's beautiful," Leda commented, looking at the river of water meandering through the green plains. She, who had never left Dorne, had only been to Volantis and nothing else, so Westeros was completely new to her eyes. Enar didn't look at Mander. His eyes were focused on the huge castle built on a particularly high hill. Highgarden, the house of Tyrell's residence. Enar smiled and forced Caraxes to lower his altitude, making the castle seem closer and closer. On the plains below, Willis Tyrell, wearing green and gold armor, was riding a horse expertly, despite being crippled in one leg. Knights of House Tyrell were protecting their lord, riding around him. The face of the heir of Highgarden was calm. It had been a few days since he had ridden on the Reach. It wasn't just for entertainment that he was doing this, but to see the surrounding terrain. He wanted to see if he might have other options should a war break out in the future. Burning crops was indeed a great threat, but in the face of Tywin Lannister, the most ruthless man in Westeros, he felt that threatening a powerful man like Tywin with something so trivial in the face of the outcome of war was a bit risky. "Milord Dash," just as one of Willis' knights was about to speak, the loud, powerful sound rang out above them, and a darkness covered everyone. Confused, as there had been no sign of rain moments ago, Willis looked up and paled at the sight of the gigantic crimson shadow passing above him, causing strong winds to blow anything below. All the horses were intimidated by the aura of the biggest predator in the planet's food chain. "Go back to the Highgarden." Willis grabbed his horse's reins and shouted to his riders. He wasted no time and rode at full speed towards the upper garden. An anxious expression appeared on the heir of the Reach. He was praying to the Seven that Prince Targaryen would be someone understanding. Roar! The loud, powerful and savage roar shook the white walls of Highgarden. The sound of deafening wing beats echoed throughout the castle before everyone heard a loud, heavy thud on the ground. Caraxes had landed in Highgarden. The poor dragon had been flying for almost half a day. With the spectacle he had put on in King's Landing, he was really exhausted at that point. Enar loosened the belt that held him together with Leda and finally felt able to move as he pleased. Instead of climbing down the iron mesh below the saddle, he slid down the membrane of the dragon's wing, falling gently to the ground as he removed both gloves from his hands. Leda followed her king down after him. The girl had an expression of relief as she finally felt the ground beneath her feet. If it were possible, she would never want to fly again. However, knowing her king's slightly sadistic personality, she knew that her wish was impossible. Without knowing what Leda was thinking, Enar walked up next to Carax's neck and skillfully stroked the dragon's long scales. "Thank you, brother," he said in a grateful tone as he felt the warm touch of Carax's scales. Caraxes let out a trill, similar to the sound of a cat, and seemed to enjoy the caresses. The tremor in his scales clearly showed the pleasure he was feeling. Leda was speechless as she watched that huge dragon melt under Enar's caresses. The scene was so absurd that she couldn't say anything, just letting out a sigh. However, her eyes focused on the man behind a branch of meticulously trimmed bushes. It was a gardener, who was completely frightened. Olenna, along with Mace, Lord of Highgarden, Lady Allery Hightower, Garland, Loras and Marjorie, surrounded by hundreds of knights, approached and observed the scene of a man stroking a huge dragon as if it were a cat. Seeing the golden white hair, Olenna didn't need to be a genius to deduce the man's identity, or rather the boy's, noticing some still childish features on his face. Looking at her son, who was paralyzed and had no intention of greeting the future sovereign, Olenna discreetly stepped on his foot and gave him a cold stare. The pain in his foot and the look on his mother's face roused Mace from his shock. Suppressing the fear in his heart, the Lord of Highgarden took a step forward. But the moment he did, the next scene made his blood run cold. The huge dragon suddenly raised its head and moved it forward, showing off its large, extremely sharp teeth. "Relax, Caraxes. It's not food, at least not at the moment." Enar laughed as he noticed the frightened expression on the Highgarden Lord's face and spoke in a gentle tone to Caraxes, who merely blew smoke out of his nostrils before resting his head back on the grass. Watching the scene, Olenna sighed wearily. With her hands on her stomach, she bowed slightly and spoke in a calm tone. "Welcome to High Garden, Prince Enar." As soon as she spoke, Mace awoke from his fear and bowed, followed by his wife, sons, and daughters. "Welcome to High Garden, Prince." "Sorry for the abrupt arrival, Lord Mace and Lady Allery." Enar spoke first to the lords of High Garden. Mace seemed flattered to be greeted before his mother, which brought a smile to his lips and dispelled his fear of the dragon. Allery just nodded, watching the Targaryen prince curiously. It wasn't every day that you saw a real dragon lord. Enar then turned his gaze to the old woman wearing green clothes that covered even her hair, leaving only her face showing. The famous Queen of Thorns. He commented in an amused tone, noticing that, even in front of Caraxes, there was no fear in her eyes. The famous Dragon Prince. Olenna pretended to be impressed and replied with a sarcastic tone, "I'm really surprised. You look like your father." Enar laughed at her words, without feeling offended by her tone. After constantly dealing with fanatics and sycophants, Olenna's attitude seemed like a breath of fresh air. Leda, however, cast a cold glance at the woman who dared to speak to her king like that. Perhaps noticing the young woman's deadly stare, Olenna looked at her curiously. But her curiosity was satisfied when she looked at the hilt of the sword. Dawn. With the armor and white cloak over her shoulders, Olenna quickly recognized the girl's identity and position. Nevertheless, she was surprised. There had never been a woman in the royal guard, even though a woman had created the order. This showed that the prince was more open-minded than many men in Westeros. After all, being protected by a woman wasn't exactly frowned upon. Even so, Olenna showed no weakness in the face of the cold gaze of such a young girl. She didn't fear the dragon, let alone a girl wielding a famous sword. "My lady commander of the royal guard and I are starving after half a day's journey." Ignoring the exchange of cold glances between the two women, Enar spoke with a smile on his face. "I will arrange it urgently, Your Grace." Seeing that Enar seemed easy to talk to, Mace relaxed and invited him in with an enthusiastic smile. The idea of marrying Marjorie was discarded the moment he saw the dragon. Just the thought that his grandchildren could possess such a great beast made Mace abandon any intention of marrying Marjorie to Prince Joffrey. Seeing her son's expression, Olenna wanted to hit Mace again, but held back in front of the Targaryen prince. However, she was determined to teach her son another lesson at another time. Enar smiled and followed the whole of House Tyrell as he felt everyone's gaze focused on him, whether out of curiosity or for some other reason. Noticing a particularly intense gaze on him, Enar looked discreetly to the side and saw Loras Tyrell watching him with a passionate expression. Enar was speechless, but decided to pretend he hadn't seen anything. He had nothing against it, but his sexual orientation was completely towards women. He wasn't attracted to men at all. However, another look caught his eye. Following the source, he saw a beautiful girl with voluminous brown hair and large, lovely eyes, looking at him with a shy, curious gaze. As he blinked at her, Enar heard a soft laugh coming from the young woman and smiled too. Marjorie Tyrell, one of his 3 mistresses. The son she would have with him would be a figure of great importance in the future, being one of the 20 primarchs. Olenna noticed the small movements between Enar and Marjorie, although she didn't show it. The Queen of Thorns' eyes analyzed her granddaughter carefully, in a deep gaze that carried years of wisdom and expectation. She knew Marjorie better than anyone. Olenna had taught her everything she knew. Every graceful gesture, every carefully calculated smile, every gentle glance, and even the melodious laugh that seemed spontaneous. It was all part of a skillfully molded arsenal for winning hearts. Marjorie was ambitious. Perhaps even more so than Olenna had been in her youth. The desire for power burned in her like an intense flame, and the crown wasn't just a goal. It was an absolute dream, the destiny she was determined to reach. Olenna saw this clearly. Every word Marjorie exchanged with Enar was wrapped in a layer of charm and intent. Every move, even the most subtle, was a move in the great game. The old matriarch wasn't sure whether to admire or fear her granddaughter for this. "Have no regrets, Marjorie. Everyone must bear the consequences of their actions," Olenna thought, watching the two of them gradually converse, apparently having a normal, fun conversation. Marjorie, for her part, certainly didn't know what her grandmother was thinking, and if she did, she wouldn't have cared. In her eyes, all the focus was on that handsome, powerful dragon rider by her side. Sitting at the head seat of the high garden table, Einar looked at Olenna and commented with an amused tone. Before I came to the high garden, I flew over King's Landing. They were happy to see Caraxes spitting flames over the city. Olenna stopped her drinking and looked deeply at the king. Her lips curved into a sarcastic smile. Tywin must have loved the show. The Queen of Thorns knew that the young king's words had another purpose, a warning to House Tyrell. Basically, he was saying that everyone knew he was coming to Highgarden, and that no one would believe that House Tyrell wouldn't bend the knee to survive. It was quite a shrewd move, and considering his age, Olenna knew that the young king was not inexperienced in court affairs. He's probably more desperate to fill his coffers. Einar said, bringing the glass of wine to his lips, not caring if it was poisoned. Olenna looked at Einar with a brief expression of surprise. Tywin worried about gold? She would never have thought that such words could be associated with the rich and powerful Tywin Lannister. Olenna's mind quickly searched for options that could make Tywin worry about gold and found the answer. Are the gold mines running out? Olenna asked with a glare. If that were really the case, then House Tyrell would currently be the strongest house in Westeros. Without money, the Westerlands weren't so dangerous, as they couldn't support an army of 50,000 men. Einar liked to talk to intelligent people. He didn't even need to explain, and Olenna had already found the reason for his words. Lady Olenna is as intelligent as the rumors say. Einar complimented the woman with a glare. Won't you become my master of coin? This time it was the turn of everyone at the table to look at the young king with expressions of surprise. Even Olenna looked at Einar with an amused look. The vain lords will be uncomfortable with a woman in power. Olenna replied in a calm tone as she sipped her wine. Let them feel uncomfortable, I don't care what they think. Einar sipped the wine from her glass and replied with an indifferent tone. I don't care what's between a person's legs. As long as it's useful to me, I can even put a horse on the small council. If they don't like my decisions, they can leave. There are other people who can take their place. Olenna's eyes shone with intensity, and she looked at the young king with an unexpected gaze. I'm glad of the invitation, but I'd rather spend the rest of my days in this relaxed land. I've long since left the intrigues of the court. Olenna responded to Einar's words with a calm, deep tone. Her eyes had analyzed his every action, expression, and word since they began talking. All to understand what Einar's character was. What a shame. I'd love to have Lady Olenna by my side with Tyrion. The two of you would get on very well. Einar said in a disappointed voice. He wasn't lying when he said that. He really wanted Olenna as his left hand, next to Tyrion, who was his right hand. Tyrion Lannister? Tywin's son. Olenna looked at Einar strangely and asked with a hint of incredulity in her voice. Not in her wildest dreams could she have imagined that Tyrion Lannister had bent the knee to the enemy of House Lannister, let alone that Einar could forgive him. Noticing the incredulity on Olenna's face, Einar commented in an amused tone, What can I do? I'm a persuasive man. Tyrion has agreed to be my hand. Your Grace is very open-minded. Many would have killed Tyrion for much less. Olenna gave Einar a deep look. She finally believed that Einar was different from all the men she had met in her long life. Einar smiled and replied, I'm not a monster, Lady Olenna. The only people I want dead are Tywin Joffrey, my cousin Robert, and Gregor Clegane. The others can bend the knee and survive. I'm a benevolent monarch. He wasn't lying, at least not yet. The entire system of government in Westeros would remain the same for some time. When he began his reforms, he would eliminate any rebels who didn't accept the new rules he had made. For now, he would forgive them all. Although I can't hold the position of Master of Coin, my grandson Willis is as competent as I am. Olenna said. If he's as competent as Lady Olenna says, I don't mind having Willis on my small council. But if he's a worthless piece of crap, I'll oust him without any hesitation. I don't need no good-for-nothings on my small council. Einar spoke in a harsh tone, not hiding what she would do to Willis if he wasn't a good fit for the position of Master of Coin. Olenna wasn't offended by Enar's words. On the contrary, she looked at the young monarch with an even more appreciative gaze. "I would do the same, Your Grace. Don't hesitate to remove the useless and put the competent on the small council. Many monarchs have gotten this wrong, causing great losses to the kingdom." Enar nodded, and just as he was about to speak, the doors to the dining hall opened abruptly. A young man rushed in, with an anxious expression on his handsome face. Green and gold armor framed his slim, seemingly frail body. "I assume this is my new master of coin," Enar commented with an amused tone. "Willis, this is Enar Targaryen, first of his name. You are the new master of coin of the small council." Ignoring her grandson's surprised expression, Olenna spoke directly, without beating about the bush. Willis, who had crossed the hall as quickly as he could, felt his breath catch for a moment when he heard his grandmother's words. Master of coin. Him? Recovering from his stupor, Willis understood that this was the position his grandmother had obtained for him. He approached Enar with his crutch and did not hesitate to kneel before the young monarch, who was sitting in the main seat, with Olenna on his left and Mace Tyrell on his right. "I am Willis of House Tyrell, Your Grace," he said, facing the young man with silver hair and violet eyes who was watching him intently. "Rise, my master of coin," Enar replied with a firm, majestic tone. At that moment, his aura changed completely. He no longer seemed just gentle and courteous, but a true king. Marjorie and Loras, who were watching the scene from afar, couldn't help but stare at Enar with growing admiration. Marjorie, in particular, would have displayed an expression not at all appropriate for an unmarried lady, had her family not been present. Willis stood up with some difficulty and bowed. "Thank you, Your Grace. I won't let you down." To say he wasn't excited would be a lie. He had always wanted to do something besides being Lord of the High Garden and Lord Paramount of Mandor. Now he had the chance to accomplish something great and leave his name in history. "Oberyn, my Master of Laws, spoke very highly of you, Lord Willis," Enar commented with a smile as he saw Willis sit down next to Marjorie. Although he had not yet made Oberyn official as Master of Laws, he was prepared to do so in the future. The instant Oberyn's name was mentioned, the big smile of Mace Tyrell, Lord of the High Garden, turned slightly grim. If there was anyone Mace hated deeply, it was Oberyn Martell. Willis had been crippled because of him, but surprisingly, the two had become great friends. Willis' smile grew when he heard that his longtime friend had been chosen as Master of Laws on the small council of Enar, Dorne and the Reach. Olenna commented with a keen eye. As House Tyrell had already accepted Enar as their monarch, it was time to prepare for war. Having two kingdoms on their side was already a great advantage. The North, Dorne, and the Reach. Enar corrected Olenna gently, causing her to look at him with an expression of complete shock. Then, remembering Enar's origins, Olenna muttered, "Honorable, loyal, silent? Even a wolf can lie." "Is the North with us, Your Grace?" Olenna asked with a deep look. "Yes. My uncle Eddard Stark, of House Stark and Lord of the North, has already bent the knee." Enar nodded, confirming Olenna's thoughts. "Your Grace was raised in the North, wasn't he? Eddard Stark's bastard." Although it was a question, Olenna was certain of her words. Enar looked at Olenna and shrugged. It wasn't exactly something that could be hidden for eternity. Olenna smiled. Just imagining Robert's face when he found out about the betrayal of the man he considered his brother gave her a certain pleasure. The usurper's expression would certainly be memorable. If the North has bent the knee, so can the Riverlands. Olenna commented, remembering that Eddard Stark's wife was Catelyn Tully, daughter of Hoster Tully, Lord Paramount of the Trident and Lord of Riverrun. However, at the mention of House Tully, she noticed how the young king's countenance darkened. Enar's face took on a dark mixture of restrained fury and murderous intent. The light atmosphere of the hall was immediately replaced by an oppressive weight. Everyone around them paled slightly, not understanding why, but feeling the difficulty of breathing grow by the second. The existence of Tully House is still under consideration. Enar commented with a cold tone, his icy eyes resting on Olenna, devoid of any emotion. The reason for Enar's anger was simple. Hoster Tully had rebelled for no apparent reason, turning traitor just to try and get his blood on the Iron Throne. But the old fish didn't expect Jon Arryn and Eddard Stark to refuse such an ambition, completely thwarting his plans. Of all the great houses, only the Tully were under serious consideration of extinction. For Enar, there was nothing more despicable than ingratitude. House Targaryen had raised the Tully to their peak, but in the end, they were the first to betray them, and for no justifiable reason. Although she remained calm, Olenna felt a chill run through her body as she realized the intensity of Enar's aura. Despite her long life and experience, she had the strange feeling that she was facing something other than human. She thought herself foolish for such thoughts, but how could she explain the oppression in the air? Could it be magic? Perhaps. However, Olenna believed it could be something deeper. "Your Grace, your wine." Leda approached and poured another goblet for the king. The lady commander of the royal guard watched Enar's dark face calmly. Although it was the first time she had seen him so consumed with rage, she was not intimidated by the frightening aura emanating from him. Enar's countenance softened after a sip of the wine. He realized that he was allowing his emotions to take control, something that could never happen again. Losing control would be dangerous, perhaps fatal for those around him. "Thank you, Leda." Enar thanked her with a gentle smile, while deciding internally that he would perform the life enhancement on Leda that evening. His loyal lady commander deserved a boost in all physical aspects. Leda just nodded and stood behind Enar's chair, her hand on the hilt of her sword, ready to draw it at any moment. With Enar's words, the atmosphere became light again. Mace Tyrell, in particular, silently thanked the gods for this. The Lord of Highgarden's face was sweaty and pale, as if he had just run for miles without stopping. "Lord Mace." Enar called out, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Mace Tyrell, already shaken by recent events, replied with a trembling tone, "Yes, Your Grace." "How much food does Reach currently have, and what is the average harvest time?" Enar asked, his face serious. The Reach had always been the breadbasket of Westeros, and on a continent where the weather could be unpredictable, with winters lasting years or even decades, the management of food resources was paramount. With the long night approaching, stocking up on food in large quantities was an absolute priority. Running out of supplies in sunless years would be catastrophic. Although Enar considered the possibility of using the energy of the Immaterium dimension to act as a temporary sun for the crops, this would lock him into a single location, unable to move should he need to respond to an attack from monsters in another realm. Mace wiped the sweat from his brow before replying, "We have enough food to supply the entire kingdom for 5 years. As for crops, wheat and oats take 3 to 4 months to ripen successfully. Other types of food can take a little longer, but 6 months at most." Despite his reputation for being less than competent, Mace was still the Lord of the Reach and knew well the figures that underpinned his house's economy. "Very well." Enar nodded. Then his voice became harsh, unquestioning. "Stop selling food to Essos immediately. I want you to start stocking up as much as possible." Mace hesitated, but Enar didn't finish. "Also, send enough food to sustain 100,000 men for 3 months to the north." Mace stared wide-eyed, stunned. He couldn't imagine the reason for such specific orders. "Is there a problem in the north, Your Grace? The last shipment of food sent to them should be enough." It was enough before 100,000 savages crossed the wall. Enar replied calmly, but his words provoked expressions of surprise and astonishment from everyone around. 100,000 savages? Why would Your Grace allow these savages to cross the wall and enter the north? Olenna asked with apparent calm, although her mind worked quickly to understand the reasons behind such a decision. "Because I don't want our real enemy to gain 100,000 men, women, and giants without any effort." Enar replied, his voice laden with conviction. He knew that the threat of the White Walkers and the Night King could no longer be ignored. The sooner the kingdoms recognized this threat, the quicker he could consolidate his position as savior of Westeros in the face of the impending darkness. "Robert? But he can't ally himself with the wildlings," Mace said, even more confused. The idea of Robert I Baratheon allying himself with the men beyond the wall seemed too absurd. "I'm not talking about my cousin," Enar corrected, his sharp gaze settling on Mace. "I'm talking about the Night King and his White Walkers. They command an army of undead who don't need to eat or rest." An amused smile appeared on Enar's lips as he observed the reactions around him. Then silence fell over the room. The revelation seemed to suck the air out of the room. Everyone processed the young king's words in their own way, but it was clear that a new weight had been placed on everyone's shoulders. "Night King, White Walkers, Giants?" Olenna repeated, with an incredulous tone, as if she expected the young king to be telling a bad joke. However, when she looked into Enar's eyes, her expression changed. There was no humor, just a cold, impenetrable seriousness. "I understand it's hard to believe," Enar began, his voice calm and firm, "but the long night is coming. And with it, an army of monsters, including undead." Enar knew that words alone would not be enough to convince the others. The stories of the Long Night and the White Walkers were considered ancient legends, something too distant to be taken seriously. But he possessed something more powerful than words. He could show. Fixing his gaze first on Mace and then on Olenna, he used a fragment of the future, bringing a vision that spoke for itself. What they saw was simple and at the same time terrifying. A vast, snow-covered plain stretched as far as the eye could see. A white mist, thick as milk, enveloped everything around, creating a heavy silence. Then the sound of horses breaking through the snow echoed. Figures emerged from the mist. Olenna and Mace held their breath at the sight of decaying horses, exposed bones and rotting flesh. But the real terror was in the riders. They were tall and thin, with skin as pale as ivory and icy blue eyes that shone like ice stars. Their bones were translucent, almost shiny, and their blood, if it still existed, looked a cold, pale blue. Their numbers seemed small at first glance, perhaps 5,000 riders. But what followed was a real nightmare, an endless army, undead marching in endless ranks. Suddenly, the army opened up into a perfect corridor. Out of the mist emerged a figure mounted on an immense ice spider. He had a crown made of ice on his head, which seemed to be carved from frozen stone. His eyes glowed with a flaming, inhuman blue that pierced the soul like a blade of ice. A supernatural chill ran through Olenna and Mace's bodies, making them shiver uncontrollably. It was as if death itself was staring at them, icy and implacable. And then, in the blink of an eye, they were back in their chairs in the lounge. They were both breathing heavily, their chests rising and falling in despair. Sweat covered their faces, and fear was clear in their eyes. "That's what's coming towards us." Enar broke the silence, his voice calm and authoritative. His implacable confidence seemed like a point of light amidst the despair of the sight. Olenna stared at him, still trying to process what she had just experienced. Mace, paler than ever, raised a trembling hand and wiped the sweat from his brow. "I'll immediately send the food north and start stocking up as much as possible," Mace declared, his voice still weak but determined. He didn't know how Enar had shown him that vision, and frankly, he didn't care. All he wanted now was for the gods to be merciful and save Westeros from the terrible fate that seemed inevitable. Entering the room on the top floor of one of the towers in Highgarden Castle, Enar watched as Leda inspected her surroundings, checking for any possible hidden threats. Satisfied, he flopped onto the bed, staring at the ceiling. "What do you think of House Tyrell, my lady commander of the Kingsguard?" Leda continued to examine the room, running her fingers along the walls, searching for secret passages, before answering coolly, "I don't like Lady Olenna. She seems irritating. Lord Mace is mediocre in battle, but reasonable in the administration of his lands. Lady Allery lives in her own world. Lord Garland is a decent warrior, but lacks the aggressiveness needed to command real respect on the battlefield. As for Lady Marjorie and Lord Loras, they both want to lie with your grace." She touched a suspicious stone on the wall and narrowed her eyes as she noticed a slight change in the texture. Without interrupting her analysis, she continued, "Ultimately, House Tyrell is weak. They don't control the Reach completely. Houses like Hightower and Redwine are extremely powerful and actually hold more influence than the Tyrells themselves. Enar smiled at Leda's blunt assessment. The girl rarely spoke much, but when she did, her precision was cutting. As for Marjorie and Loras, he rolled his eyes. He repeated to himself, he only liked women. Loras might feel some impulsive attraction based on lust, but for Enar, there was no romantic or physical interest in another man. Still, Leda was right. The Redwine fleet was the strongest in the kingdom. The Hightowers had the support of the Faith of the Seven and colossal influence. If it weren't for the value of loyalty oaths in Westeros, Enar wouldn't be surprised if the Tyrells were betrayed and replaced in some well-planned coup. Suddenly, the sound of moving stones echoed through the room. Enar raised an eyebrow, watching Leda curiously. In front of her, a secret passage revealed itself, large enough for a tall adult to pass through without difficulty. Leda nodded, pleased to have found what she was looking for. It was common for ancient castles to have hidden passages for strategic escapes. Highgarden, built in the Age of Heroes, would certainly have several of them. After closing the passage, she resumed her inspection of the room, but no other wall, pillar or floor concealed secrets like that. Take off your armor and clothes. Let's start your physical enhancement. Enar sat down on a chair, watching her with an amused look. But his smile soon gave way to a disappointed expression as Leda, without hesitation, began to undress with complete indifference. She removed each garment with the calm of someone who was simply shedding unnecessary weight without any sense of shame at undressing in front of a man. I expected you to blush like a lady, Enar commented, rising from his chair as he circled the naked body of the lady commander of his royal guard. Leda rolled her eyes, crossing her arms over her small, firm breasts. Forgive me for not blushing like a virgin lady, Your Grace. Enar laughed. You're forgiven. She rolled her eyes again. Her king's narcissism and conceit were truly unshakable. As he watched her, Enar couldn't help but notice the scars all over her body. Most were concentrated on her belly, some on her arms and shoulders. They weren't large, the largest was no more than 5 centimeters, but they had all been made by something sharp. He reached out, touching the largest scar, located on her abdomen. His fingers glided over the skin for a few moments, studying the mark with a curious gaze, before moving away. Throughout the process, Leda remained impassive. For her, the body was just an instrument. She didn't see herself as a woman, but as a sword. And that was how she preferred to live. It was easier to live as a sword than as a woman. I can alter your body in the process, Enar said, stopping in front of her, staring at the girl in her cold gray eyes. Do you wish to change anything in particular? Leda reflected for a brief moment, but her answer came without hesitation. Speed to the extreme. And if possible, eliminate my period, Your Grace. Enar raised an eyebrow in surprise. You'll be infertile if I do that. I don't care. I'm your sword and nothing more. Swords don't need to give birth to heirs. Leda replied with a cold, indifferent, almost inhuman tone. Her gaze remained empty, devoid of any emotion. Only when her eyes landed on Enar did her expression change. There was something there, not love, not desire, but absolute devotion and unbreakable loyalty. Enar let out a soft sigh, his fingers gliding gently over Leda's androgynous face. Thank you, Leda. I promise to be a worthy king, worthy to be the master of your blade. Then his gaze turned sharp. Kneel. Without hesitation, Leda obeyed. Her slender body descended to the stone floor, her knees touching the cold surface while her head remained raised firm. Enar lifted Lady Lya, the blade making a horizontal cut across his own wrist. Scarlet blood oozed from the wound, not in mere drops, but in torrents impossible for an ordinary human being. The crimson liquid pulsed as if it had a life of its own, flowing, moving, gradually covering Leda's naked body like an organic, burning veil. It's going to hurt, Leda. His voice, although gentle, carried an overwhelming weight. It will be a worse pain than giving birth. But if you endure it, you will no longer be a mere human. You'll be something greater. You will live far beyond the expectations of any mortal. You will have powers derived from my blood. He leaned in slightly, his purple eyes staring at her with intensity. In a sense, you will be my daughter, just as I will be your father. The enrichment ceremony was no simple ritual. It was a brutal process, where only those with truly determined minds and character could emerge as something more. Those who failed ceased to be human. They became deformed aberrations, irrational beasts devoured by the very force they were trying to master. Inar would not perform this ritual lightly. His wives and mistresses would be subjected to this process one day, but only when they were properly prepared. His troops would undergo a similar process, but on a smaller scale, and would not be as powerful as the Primarchs, the new stage of human evolution. At the moment, apart from Titus, Sigismund, Barristan and Leda, Inar didn't see anyone else strong enough to withstand the process without prior training. The pain came like a raging storm. Leda's bones broke one by one, only to rebuild themselves stronger. Her blood seemed to boil in her veins, burning her from the inside out. Her senses collapsed, sight, hearing, touch, all blending together in absolute chaos, as if her own body was becoming something new and unknown. But in the midst of that maelstrom of pain, she heard Inar's voice, and it clung to her like a beacon in the darkness. Her lips remained firmly closed. No moan escaped. No sign of weakness was shown. She would endure. She would survive. For it was the king's sword. And good swords don't break. Inar watched the whole process with a calm gaze. Unlike Titus and Sigismund, who didn't feel much because they were seriously injured, Leda was feeling a pain that was simply too difficult to describe with human words. And unlike both of them, Inar hadn't drunk the water of life when he enhanced both of his generals. Leda was practically performing a 2.0 ceremony, modified and improved, but incredibly more intense than Titus and Sigismund had been. But the rewards were also twice as valuable, and that's what happened to Leda. Opening her eyes, Leda's eyes were still gray, but there was something else in her eyes. Blue rays could be seen running through her irises. The air around her crackled, small, thin gray rays gradually surrounded her naked figure. The smell of ozone filled the air, a smell reminiscent of rainy times during storms. Her size hadn't grown. She was still relatively short like any ordinary woman, but the intensity of her aura was simply impossible for any powerful man or woman to match. Inar couldn't help but nod with satisfaction at his masterpiece. Leda had developed psychic powers before Titus and Sigismund, which was incredible in his eyes. He had already theorized that those who baptized themselves using his blood would develop powers, just like the Dragon Lords of Valyria. But a process that took hundreds or thousands of years to happen with blood magic happened in mere moments. And although the chances of dying exceeded 95%, the results satisfied Inar. He only had to create a simplified version with a 30% mortality rate. Leda, the blade of Inar. Inar declared, seeing the girl in front of him. His cousin had become something truly incredible in human eyes. "How are you feeling, my dear cousin?" Inar asked with a curious tone. Leda, who was still naked and covered in blood in front of Inar, looked down at her hands and felt limitless power coursing through her veins. It was an electrifying feeling, and with a thought, her hand began to emit small, thin gray rays. If you don't understand the reference, you're not a man of culture. Leda's eyes widened at the sight of the rays dancing between her fingers. She still couldn't believe that she was controlling power that only the gods could possess. It won't be very powerful at the moment, but it will become a real weapon in your hands in the future. For now, it only serves to impress people. Inar commented with an amused tone, watching Leda play with the rays like a curious child. Leda woke up to hear Inar's words and quickly knelt down in front of him again. "Thank you, Your Grace. I will be your blade until the end of my days. I will protect you with all my body, mind, and soul." Her gray eyes looked straight into his purple eyes. There were no feelings she could express other than her devotion and loyalty as much as possible. I'm glad, because I'm going to abuse that oath, Leda. Einar spoke not flowery words, but the plain truth. He really would need Leda's services until her last moment. Leda showed no reaction other than a touch of happiness. For a sword, there was nothing happier than being used to kill her king's enemies. In addition to lightning control, you will gradually grow over time, easily reaching 250 centimeters in height. Einar spoke, looking at Leda's shocked expression after hearing his words. 250 cm equals 8 feet 2 inches. He himself would be over 350 centimeters tall in the future. Now he was only about 185 centimeters tall. 350 cm equals 11 feet 4 inches. I don't know the US metric system, and since I don't trust the answers of an AI, I calculated it myself, but I don't think it's right. Correct me if I'm wrong. Leda looked at Dawn in her hand and thought she would have to redo the sword. After all, her sword, although wide, was nowhere near long enough to be wielded by someone so tall. The shock of knowing it would grow so large was greater than the shock of controlling lightning, the power of the gods. Don't let the handmaiden see you covered in blood. I don't want rumors that I'm a sick man who likes blood. Einar said, ready to bathe. A bath that was already waiting for him after a long journey. Leda nodded and followed Einar to bathe. Although she didn't mind Einar's blood covering her, she didn't want her king to be slandered by fakes after seeing her covered in blood. The next day, in the castle gardens of House Tyrell, Einar was dressed in an opulent red suit, a purple cloak over his left shoulder, falling elegantly over his chest. The choice of dress was majestic, fit for a king. If there was one thing he could admit, it was that Joffrey Baratheon had been human garbage in every respect. But when it came to style, even Einar had to acknowledge that the boy dressed exquisitely. So much so that he had chosen this style of clothing that Mace had given him earlier. Looking at Leda, Einar saw that she was wearing the standard armor of the Kingsguard, the armor and cloaks of a shade of white. Others couldn't tell, but Leda had grown about 3 centimeters in a single night. Turning to look at Caraxes, Einar could see that his brother was in a bad mood, which was understandable given that there were many eyes staring at him full of fear and admiration. They were all gardeners and servants who were watching the huge dragon with mixed emotions. If Caraxes hadn't had a calmer temperament when it came to anything that didn't involve war or his knight, the dragon would have attacked these people a long time ago. Suddenly, Einar heard footsteps walking towards him and soon heard a sweet, gentle voice. "Good morning, Your Grace." Turning around, Einar saw Marjorie wearing a black dress, which matched his own clothes perfectly. A blind man could see that Marjorie was dressing that way on purpose. But Einar liked this subtle game of seduction. The girl was ambitious, too ambitious, but nothing he couldn't control. He would control humanity. If he couldn't control a woman, he might as well kill himself and let the omniscient and omnipotent God choose someone else instead. "You look beautiful, Lady Marjorie." If Marjorie wanted to play this game, Einar would too. The smile on Marjorie's face grew as she listened to Einar. She looked at the handsome king before her and couldn't help imagining herself being crowned in the September of Baelor alongside him. After appreciating the beautiful sight that was Einar, Marjorie turned her focus to Caraxes. She admired the huge creature with a mixture of ambition and admiration. Her gaze wandered between Caraxes and Einar, then she said with an innocent smile, "He's so majestic and big." Einar's lips twitched at Marjorie's possible insinuation. The girl really wasn't playing at this game of seduction. Even Leda couldn't help but roll her eyes. The young lady of Highgarden was practically wanting to throw herself into her king's bed, but she still didn't like this girl. Leda preferred Princess Daenerys and Princess Visenya. Both were women who really cared about her king, not this ambitious girl who only wanted the power that would come with marrying Einar. But as a vassal and a sword, she only cared about what Einar wanted and desired. "Does your grace plan to stay long in Highgarden? We can go and relax by sailing on the Mander. My private ship is ready to leave at a moment's notice." Marjorie stopped looking at Caraxes and spoke, looking at Einar with a pleading, innocent look. She probably thought that there wouldn't be a single man in the world who could resist her gaze, but unfortunately for Marjorie, she met such a man today. "I beg your pardon, Lady Marjorie." Einar showed an expression of regret and continued speaking. I have urgent business with my uncle Eddard." How could Einar waste time relaxing while an army of wildlings was gathering at the wall at this very moment? Especially with Mance holding the Horn of Winter, an artifact that could bring down the wall at any moment. Einar had to get to the north as quickly as possible to warn his uncle about the savage army and notify all the noble houses in the north. At the same time, he had to destroy House Bolton. The evil seed he had planted years ago had finally blossomed, and he had to reap the fruits of his conspiracy. There were too many things to do and too little time. He couldn't relax with Marjorie. Marjorie had a regretful look on her face, but having learned the art of seduction from her grandmother, she didn't act like a spoiled girl, but like an obedient wife. "Have a safe journey, Your Grace." Einar smiled at her words. He approached her and got dangerously close to the face of the young lady of House Tyrell. Gently holding her neck with one hand, he whispered in an amused tone, "I like this game of seduction between you and me." Marjorie felt a shiver run through her body at his words. A feeling of weakness almost made her fall to the ground. The hand that gently held her neck didn't make her afraid, but it did give her a feeling of excitement. "I will enjoy playing with you, Marjorie of House Tyrell, but be careful when playing with fire. People often get burned by fire." Einar spoke in a gentle tone as he let go of her neck. Marjorie didn't know how she stood, but she smiled elegantly and replied with an innocent tone, as if she didn't understand what Einar was saying. "Highgarden will always have its gates open to Your Grace." "The gates of Highgarden or the doors of your rooms?" Einar asked with a curious tone. "Both." Marjorie replied with a sweet smile. Einar just laughed and walked away, leaving the young woman to watch his back with a stare that was a little frightening for those watching the scene from the outside. North Westeros, Dreadfort Castle. "Ramsay, are you all right?" Domeric, heir to the Dreadfort, knocked on his half-brother's bedroom door and asked with a worried tone. Domeric, like Ramsay Snow and Roose Bolton, had the strangely pale eyes of House Bolton. He was handsome, tall and possessed great charisma. A true knight in every sense of the word. A strangely worthy heir to House Bolton. "Come in." Domeric heard his half-brother's hoarse, cold, and angry voice. Entering the room, Domeric looked at his brother and saw his hideous face. If he was ugly before, now he really looked like a living nightmare, capable of frightening even the great John of House Umber, known for his courage and bravery on the battlefield. "What do you want, brother?" Ramsay asked with a cold tone, not bothering to show respect to the Dreadfort heir. His pale eyes were fixed on his brother's face, and, as if sensing the pity and regret in his gaze, his already cold eyes became completely devoid of emotion. Showing a smile that was more ugly than anything else, Ramsay poured a glass of wine for his brother and offered it to Domeric, who didn't notice a few drops of a slightly greenish poison quickly dissolving in his drink. Domeric, who had never thought that his brother, whom he had always cared for and loved, would actually poison him at that moment, sipped the wine nonchalantly and asked worriedly, "If you tell me who did this to you, I swear I will seek justice in your name, Ramsay. Lord Stark will surely find and punish the murderer who killed your men and committed such an atrocity." Ramsay's face turned extremely grim at the mention of Lord Stark of Winterfell. Find the murderer and seek justice for him? When had he ever had justice in his life? Every day he was despised, even by the castle servants. His mother was nothing more than an unimportant commoner. His father never liked him. The word justice and Ramsay were never in the same sentence once in his life. The world has never been fair or full of justice. Only you can get your own justice. "I'll have my revenge." Ramsay responded to his brother's words with a murderous look. "I'll have an army and destroy everything he cherishes and loves. I'll rape his sisters in front of him while I enjoy seeing the look of resentment on his face." Domeric's face changed as he heard those extremely crazy and immoral words. "Ramsay, you may be angry, but a man shouldn't do what you said, especially to women." The Dreadfort heir spoke with a firm tone, containing a reprimand. He blamed Ramsay's anger for making him think of such atrocities. "Besides, as a bastard, you can't have an army. It's against the laws of Westeros and of our liege lord, Lord Stark." Domeric continued speaking, ignoring the increasingly cold expression on Ramsay's face. "Yes, you're right, but as heir to the Dreadfort and future lord of the Dreadfort, I can have an army. An army controlled by the fear and horror I will make everyone feel. Ramsay commented with a cold tone. He remembered Jon Snow's strange abilities, including his ability to control people. Ramsay didn't think that magic could control an entire army. In his eyes, if Jon had such an ability, the young man would be Lord of Winterfell right now. So, since Jon couldn't control an army, he would make that man regret leaving him alive. He would take revenge, and in an extremely painful way for Jon Snow. Even though Domeric was somewhat naive, he understood the implications of Ramsay's words. Looking down at the goblet of wine in his hand, the Dreadfort heir dropped it on the floor. The goblet spun a few times before coming to a stop, splashing the purplish liquid all over the floor. Just as Domeric was about to speak, his chest began to ache. The pain was small, like a mosquito bite, but it grew rapidly. Without even realizing it, Domeric was already on the ground, clutching his throat as blood poured from his eyes, ears, and mouth. The look of fear, terror, and disbelief was reflected on the Dreadfort heir's face. He was still shocked by Ramsay's murder of him. Were bastards really synonymous with tragedy and sin? In the final moments of his life, Domeric saw some reason for the stigma that the Church of the Seven had placed on bastards. He, who had cared for Ramsay all his life, died at the hands of the person he loved most. He had pulled Ramsay out of the abyss, but Ramsay himself had pushed him back in. Pointing a trembling finger at Ramsay, Domeric felt his consciousness cloud over. Then darkness overtook his mind, and he went into the stranger's embrace. Looking at his brother lying dead on the floor, blood dripping from his eyes, ears, and mouth, Ramsay didn't care and flashed a terrifying smile. He wasn't afraid that Roose would kill him for Domeric's murder. With the death of the Dreadfort heir, Lord Bolton had only him as successor. If he died, House Bolton would cease to exist. And for any lord of a noble house, that was completely unacceptable. The Lord of the Dreadfort would put aside his personal feelings for the continuity of House Bolton. "Oh, brother. Why did you have to choke to death?" Ramsay commented with a sadistic and amused look as he wiped the blood from his dead brother's face, clearing away some evidence that Domeric had been poisoned. Putting some food down his throat, Ramsay nodded with satisfaction. One day later, Roose Bolton, staring at his lifeless son before him, the Lord of the Dreadfort wanted to roar and kill the bastard who had killed his only son. But in the end, reason overcame him and his own feelings. Roose couldn't allow the lineage of the Red Kings to be extinguished at his hands. He wouldn't have the courage to look his ancestors in the eye if House Bolton ceased to exist. "My condolences, Father Dash." Before Ramsay could finish speaking, Roose turned and punched Ramsay so hard in the face that a few teeth flew into the air and the Dreadfort bastard's nose broke. Showing a cold smile, Ramsay ignored the pain in his nose and continued to stare at his father with a feeling of pleasure bubbling up in his chest. It was the first time his father had really looked at him, and he liked that feeling. "Don't you dare talk to me so friendly, you filthy bastard son of a shitty farmer. No matter what you say, do, or how you act, you will always be a bastard in my eyes, and I will hate myself until my last days for having made you the heir to my noble house." Roose spoke with a terribly cold tone, and Ramsay's excited look only inflamed the anger in the Dreadfort Lord's chest even more. Without any hesitation, he stepped forward and knocked Ramsay to the ground. The Lord of House Bolton didn't hesitate to start hitting the bastard in the face with all his might. Blow after blow, he threw punches as if to relieve all the anger and hatred built up in his heart. Roose only stopped when he remembered that he would need the bastard to ensure the continuation of House Bolton. Getting up, he saw that Ramsay's face was now a mixture of saliva, blood, and purple bruises. However, there was no feeling of pity on Roose's face. He looked at the bastard he had sired after a rape and smiled disdainfully. "Are you happy, Dreadfort heir?" Roose commented with a terribly sadistic and cold tone, flashing a smile that was undeniably reminiscent of Ramsay's. However, despite everything that had happened, the bastard was not happy. However, despite what had happened, Ramsay smiled and replied in a hoarse and equally cold voice, "Yes, my lord father." Roose was already dead in Ramsay's eyes. He had already killed the brother who loved him. What was killing a father who hated him compared to that? Roose, hearing his words, couldn't help but look at Ramsay with a touch of fear. The person who could endure all this and show a smile couldn't be normal. He was a real monster. But again, Even if he was creating the monster that would one day kill him, Roose couldn't kill Ramsay. Roose just hoped that the old gods would be kind enough to let him have another child, so that he could finally kill Ramsay. North, Winterfell, home of House Stark. Arya, almost 6 years old, looked at her younger brother with pride as she saw Bran finally eating on his own, without any help. Previously Bran had eaten with Catelyn's help, even though he was 4 years old. This was completely unacceptable to Arya, who had taught Bran to eat alone. Looking over, she saw her older brother, Robb, eating in silence next to Theon Greyjoy, someone she didn't like at all for insulting Jon behind his back. Of course, after his father revealed Jon's true identity, the Pike heir never dared to speak ill of her brother again. Noticing the empty seat next to her father, Arya showed an uncomfortable expression. Although Catelyn forced her to learn to sew and act like a lady, in the end, her mother still loved her, and she loved her back. But ever since Jon's identity was revealed, the tension in her parents' marriage seemed to grow by the day. Catelyn no longer broke her fast with the family, preferring to stay in her room praying or reading a book, with no intention of leaving anytime soon. "Father, when will Jon be back?" 4-year-old Bran asked innocently. He missed his loving and gentle brother, who always brought him sweets to eat in secret. Knowing that Jon was the true heir to the Iron Throne didn't cause any special feelings in the boy. It just made Jon more powerful in his eyes. At the same time, Bran wondered if Jon would accept him into the Kingsguard. Like any boy who grew up and played role-playing inspired by great men like Aemon the Dragon Knight, Ser Duncan the Tall, Arthur Dayne the Morning Sword, and Barristan the Bold. Eddard let out a sigh and answered his son with a gentle look. "I don't know, Bran, but it will probably be soon." Bran, oblivious to the impact of his words, smiled broadly as he devoured his bread. 1-year-old Rickon was on his older sister's lap, helping him to eat. His meal consisted of milk, served in a spoon small enough to feed his baby mouth. Sansa, who was feeding Rickon, felt satisfied with every spoonful her brother drank. Seeing his chubby cheeks, she couldn't resist squeezing them, causing little Rickon to show an expression of displeasure. However, hearing his other brother's question, the smile on Sansa's face stiffened. The image of the handsome boy appeared in her mind. She couldn't imagine that the prince she had always dreamed of had always been by her side. And he wasn't her brother, but the cousin hidden by her father in Winterfell. Sansa looked discreetly at her father and wondered if she could marry Jon. The 8-year-old didn't know what disastrous consequences could happen if Jon's existence became known to Robert, especially Eddard Stark's betrayal, but she was still thinking about marrying Jon and becoming a queen just like in the stories she had been told. At this point, Enar had to say that the customs of Westeros were strange in certain matters. Incest between brother and sister was taboo, but incest between cousins was readily accepted as normal. Tywin Lannister himself and Joanna Lannister were first cousins, and Tywin's uncle was his own father-in-law. How such a close blood relationship was not considered incest was a mystery in the eyes of Enar, who came from another world. Eddard didn't know what his daughter was thinking, or perhaps he would actually kill old Septa for having contaminated his daughter with so many stories of knights, princes, and princesses. But the mention of Jon, or rather Enar, brought a look of emotion to Eddard's face. News of the Second Field of Fire had reached even the north. Eddard didn't know whether to be worried or proud of Enar, but he was certainly glad that everything had turned out well, at least for House Targaryen in Essos. Breakfast ended in silence. As soon as she had swallowed the last piece of bread, Arya slipped away without hesitation. She knew that her father would soon order her to attend Maester Luwin's lessons. She hated those tedious lessons that put her to sleep in less than 5 minutes. Eddard let out a weary sigh as he watched her flee, but a gentle gleam lit his eyes. His daughter reminded him of Lyanna, so much so that he sometimes wondered if Arya wasn't Lyanna herself reincarnated. In the stables, Arya was about to mount a horse when a strange sound caught her attention. It was similar to the flapping of a bird's wings, but much louder. There was something else in that noise, a guttural sound, deep and powerful. Curious, she raised her eyes to the clear northern sky. She saw a small black dot in the distance, so far away that she wondered if she was seeing things. She frowned and narrowed her vision, making the black dot clearer. The sound became more intense. The black dot grew. Then Arya understood. Her heart almost stopped. "Father." She shot back into the castle, screaming at the top of her lungs as she ran up the stairs. In the corridors, servants looked at each other in alarm. Guards stood in the way, but Arya flew past them like an arrow, climbing the steps in twos. When he reached his father's office, he didn't even bother to knock. The door opened with a bang. Eddard, who was about to start his day, froze. He had already heard his daughter's screams echoing through the castle, getting louder by the moment. Now Arya appeared before him, sweating, gasping, her eyes shining with wild happiness. She tried to speak, but she was out of breath. Recovering quickly, she declared in one breath, her voice still quivering with excitement, "A dragon is coming towards us. It's Jon. He's back." Eddard heard his daughter's words, and his eyes widened. He abruptly got up from his chair and quickly walked out of the office together with his daughter. It wasn't just Arya who had heard the sounds earlier. As long as he wasn't deaf, he could hear such a loud and clear sound at that moment. Robb, who had just dressed appropriately for a training session with Ser Roderick Castle, also looked up at the sky with shock and disbelief. There wasn't a person in the world who could see Caraxes and not marvel at his imposing, gigantic figure. Putting his training aside, Robb ran towards the stables and rode his steed towards the exit from Winterfell, where the dragon had landed earlier. In the end, Robb saw that his father was faster and was already dozens of meters ahead of him. He saw a small figure next to his father, assuming it was Arya. A large entourage left the gates of Winterfell and all headed towards the gigantic dragon now resting on the snowy ground. The closer they got, the more Robb was shocked. Seeing the size of Caraxes from afar and seeing it up close were two completely different things. Note, Caraxes is currently about 81 meters long, not counting his tail. In the year 296 he will be the size of Vhagar, and in the year 300, he will be the size of Balerion. Robb then saw Jon, or rather Enar again. He looked taller in the few months since he had seen him. His black hair was now white gold, and he was dressed exquisitely, in an apparently very expensive red suit. He looked like what you would expect from a king. However, the girl next to him caught Robb's eye, not because of her beautiful appearance, but because of her eyes. They were so similar to his father's eyes that it was simply shocking. Seeing the armor and white robes, Robb knew that the girl was part of Enar's Kingsguard, which didn't surprise him. Having known Enar since he was a boy, he knew that his cousin didn't care about gender. As long as it was useful, he would accept whoever it was. Jon. Arya jumped off the horse and without any hesitation, jumped into Enar's arms with a big smile. Enar held the girl with a smile on his lips and spoke in an amused tone. "You're a lady, behave like one." Arya practically growled at Enar's words, but said nothing and just hugged him tightly. "Welcome back home, Jon," she murmured with an emotional tone, tears threatening to fall from her eyes. Enar showed a dazed expression for a moment, but smiled broadly and hugged the girl back. "Yes, I'm home," he said with a warm smile. Inside Winterfell Castle, in the Great Hall. "So that's little Rickon." Enar spoke, looking at the baby with a gentle gaze. He then looked at Eddard Stark with admiration. It wasn't every man or woman who could bear 7 children. Eddard couldn't help but feel a little proud to see all his children finally reunited. The thing he was most proud of was his family. Anything else was irrelevant in front of him. It showed that Eddard had never been taught to rule. Brandon Stark, Eddard's brother, would never think like that and would always put House Stark above all else, just as all the lords and kings of winter had been taught for over 8,000 years. "Jon, let's train. I've gotten much better than before," Arya commented, circling Enar with a happy look full of excitement. "Arya, my name is Enar." Enar looked at Arya and corrected the girl with a soft tone. Jon Snow was a child, and Enar was the man born to rule. They were both him, but he could never be Jon Snow again. Not because he didn't want to be, but because the world forced him to be. The smile on Arya's face stiffened when she heard his words. She wanted to make a joke, but when she saw his purple eyes staring at her seriously, she knew he meant it. It saddened her. She felt like her brother had been taken away from her. "We'll train another time. I have to talk to Lord Stark and Robb." Although he knew Arya's thoughts, Enar said nothing to console her. The sooner she understood that he wasn't Jon Snow, the quicker she would adapt to this new reality. "Brother." Rob hugged Enar tightly, and they both laughed. "You look small, Rob." Enar commented in an amused tone, making Rob roll his eyes, although he still felt a little small in front of Enar. "Do I really have to drink wolf's milk to grow so much?" Rob thought, remembering the rumors he had heard from the servants about Enar's great growth. After the greetings, Rob, curious about the woman from the royal guard, looked at Lita with interest. He still couldn't help thinking how much the girl's eyes resembled those of his father. They were practically a copy of each other. "Who is it?" he asked, causing everyone to turn their gaze to Lita, who stood faithfully behind her king, protecting him at all times. Lita Dane, Lady Commander of the Royal Guard and current Morning Sword of House Dane of Starfall. Enar replied with an amused smile on her lips. His eyes couldn't help but focus on Eddard's rigid face. When Bran heard Lita's identity, he almost screamed with shock. The 4-year-old's eyes shone brighter than ever. He looked at the sword in its scabbard and was mesmerized by the handle, expecting the legendary meteorite steel sword to be drawn at any moment. There wasn't a single child, teenager, or young adult who didn't know Dawn. The sword had become legendary in the hands of Arthur Dane. Lita, who had been protecting Enar the whole time, looked discreetly at her father with a calm, indifferent gaze. She had been analyzing him ever since she first saw him and had to admit that he was an excellent swordsman these days. But she couldn't imagine how young Eddard Stark had survived and killed his uncle, Arthur Dane, a legendary man known for his incredible skill with the sword. As for other feelings, Lita found that she felt nothing surprising. In the end, although she carried his blood, he hadn't created her, so she didn't feel anything particularly special for Eddard. As Lita looked at the Lord of Winterfell, the Lord of Winterfell himself was also watching her. Although Lita's face was more androgynous, he could still recognize some of Ashara's features in the girl, especially her nose and eyebrows. Looking into Lita's gray eyes, Eddard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. He had taken a lady's purity and made her pregnant. In the end, because of a war, he couldn't marry the woman he loved and had to marry Catelyn to form alliances. He was sure Lita was his daughter. This brought a huge sense of shame to the Lord of Winterfell. He felt like dirt more than ever. Everyone called him honorable and just, but he didn't feel that way himself. What honorable man could do what he did to a woman? "Let's talk in my solar." Calming the turbulent feelings bubbling up in his chest, Eddard spoke in a seemingly calm tone, but the slight tension didn't escape Enar's notice. Not wanting to embarrass Eddard further, Enar nodded and followed the Lord of Winterfell to the Lord of the North Solar. Robb and Lita accompanied them. Once inside Eddard's manor, Enar sat down in the chair and spoke directly. "All the lords of the North must be summoned to bend the knee to me and swear their oaths of allegiance." Eddard knew this would happen, but he felt an enormous headache as he listened to his words. The lords of the North could be truly loyal, but at the same time they were the most stubborn, angry, and barbaric in Westeros. Once something was put into their minds, it was hard to change their minds. Eddard might only hate Aerys and Rhaegar, but not the other lords. Many hated House Targaryen as a whole, especially because of the deaths of his father, Rickard Stark, and his brother Brandon. And this dissatisfaction came not only from these losses, but also from a humiliation they had felt ever since Torrhen Stark had knelt before Aegon I Targaryen during the conquest of Westeros. "I'll convince them, uncle." Noticing the concern on Eddard's face, Enar spoke in a calm, regal tone. He would not allow dissent among the ranks of his army. He would rather kill all the lords and destroy the noble houses than risk being betrayed at a crucial moment. Eddard couldn't help but stare dazedly at Enar. The image of the quiet, determined child was replaced by the image of the man standing before him. Not a boy, but a real king. "Uncle, I came to Westeros ahead of schedule for other reasons." Enar spoke seriously. Although he knew that going north would announce that House Stark was submitting to a Targaryen king again, he didn't mind. Fighting the Night King and his zombie army was the most important thing at the moment. "I will open the gates of the wall and let an army of 100,000 wildlings into the north." When Enar finished speaking, Robb and Eddard's eyes widened in shock. If convincing the northern lords peacefully was unlikely before, now it was completely impossible. All the northern lords would be furious to hear Enar's words. The blood feud between the north and the savages was not recent, but dated back to the construction of the wall. 8,000 years of hatred would not be easily forgotten. But did Enar care about the anger of the northern lords? The answer was an absolute no. These days, he didn't like people saying no to him. Perhaps it was the arrogance born within him, but as someone who prized absolutism above all else in the monarchy, he wouldn't hear no from his vassals. And if it was necessary to kill all the northern lords to prevent dissent, he would do it. For his future plans, he was the god of humanity's empire and could not be contradicted in any way. Only when everyone said yes without any hesitation could humanity survive the gods of chaos that were being generated at that moment. Before I came north, I visited Highgarden, and House Tyrell bent the knee. Lord Mace will send food to help feed these 100,000 savages for months until they can grow crops on their own. Enar spoke again with a serious tone. One of Eddard's worries disappeared when he heard that the food would arrive. Even the food grown in the glass greenhouses, known in the north as glass gardens, together with the food bought from the Reach, was not enough to feed the whole north. The food would definitely not be enough for an extra 100,000 mouths. But why? Robb asked the question he wanted most at that moment. Note, I'm not going to show the scene of the White Walkers and the Night King again. After Enar showed the vision to Robb and Eddard, they both became terribly quiet. In the end, Eddard broke the silence. Will we win? The Lord of Winterfell asked with a calm tone, but behind the calm, a concern could not be hidden. Honestly, this long night is much longer than the last, but we will win. Enar replied without any hesitation. There was only pure confidence in his voice. As he had said before, this long night was indeed much bigger because of the gods personally intervening in it, but Enar would not lose. Of that, he was absolutely certain. But uncle, to facilitate the ceremony of allegiance with the lords of the north, I'll have to leave and I'll be back in half a day. Enar spoke, rising from his chair, causing everyone in the manor, including Leda, to look at him in surprise. Leda, you stay in Winterfell. Seeing that Leda wanted to follow him, Enar spoke, letting the girl, for the first time, show a rather comical expression. It was the look of a dog being abandoned. Suppressing the urge to tease the lady commander of the royal guard, Enar spoke gently, I think you and Lord Stark need to talk about a lot of things. Hearing his words, Robb looked strangely at Leda and Eddard, as if confused about what they both had to talk about. Without waiting for Leda's reply, Enar left the manor and headed for the exit of Winterfell Castle. He was about to pay the Dreadfort a visit and burn some people again. Remembering the smell of burning flesh at the second field of fire in Volantis, Enar began to feel excited. He quite liked burning his enemies, especially those he especially wanted to kill, like House Bolton. A few hours later north, Dreadfort Roose was sitting in his study with a letter in his hands. The red wax seal that sealed it bore a lion on two paws, roaring. A letter from House Lannister. Roose had already read the letter and knew what it contained. And he had to admit, he really liked what was written on the paper. Roose, of House Bolton, Guardian of the North and Lord of Winterfell. He really liked how those words sounded together. As for loyalty, Roose laughed at the idiots who were blindly loyal to a ruler. Especially House Bolton, the Red Kings, who had a long history of betrayals against the Winter Kings, even after submitting to House Stark. Like any ancient noble house, the Red Kings and the Winter Kings had a long-standing blood feud, which had never really been extinguished. At that moment, behind a secret passage, the flayed skins of the Winter Kings were proudly stretched across the wall, displaying the Red King's incredible deeds. Now, with the help of House Lannister, Roose finally had hope of achieving what no other Red King had managed, destroying House Stark. Roose wanted to laugh, and in the end, even with his son's death hanging over him, it didn't dilute the sense of euphoria and pleasure he was feeling at that moment. The Lord of the Dreadfort stopped laughing. He knew he couldn't attack too hastily. He would strike when House Stark was most vulnerable. Only by killing all the Stark men and marrying the women could he obtain the North without causing the vassals of House Stark to revolt. Suddenly, the office door opened and, under Roose's stunned eyes, a tall young man with golden white hair and purple eyes entered as if he owned the place. He picked up a jug of wine and poured himself a glass, while looking at him with an amused look. The wine is very good, better than the beer they sell in the north. Einar commented, feeling the slightly spicy taste on his tongue. Who are you and how did you get past my guards? Roos drew his sword in an instant and asked with an indifferent tone. His pale eyes, like two moons in the night sky, stared at Einar with cold lethality. Einar didn't answer. He walked over to the table and picked up the envelope containing the letter from Tywin Lannister, Lord of the Rock. Tywin is really cunning. He knows he can't fight the North with Moat Cailin in the way, so in case of betrayal, he's put an important piece hidden away to be used at the right moment. Einar commented with a nonchalant tone. Honestly, if I didn't have the ability to see the future, fighting someone so experienced would be a big problem. Roos listened in silence to the ravings of the young man in front of him. See the future? He scoffed at the boy's madness, but the feeling that something was incredibly wrong never went away. Without any hesitation, Roos attacked the young man with a cold stare. Although he didn't know how the young man had gotten into the Dreadfort, he had to die. Einar didn't even move and simply spoke with an unquestioning tone. Sit down and start writing. Under Roos's shocked eyes, his body refused to obey his commands, and he was forced to sit down, pick up a blank sheet of paper and a quill tipped with ink. Write down for all the lords of the North the words of Tywin Lannister, and tell them how much they will gain by submitting to the reign of House Bolton. Einar walked up behind Roos and spoke in a gentle tone, but that gentleness only made the Lord of the Dreadfort's face paler than his own eyes, if such a thing was possible in the first place. Roos wanted to stop, but no matter how much he screamed in his mind, his body simply wouldn't obey his orders. And if he kept writing and sending those letters to all the Northern Lords, he was sure that House Bolton would be destroyed. Although House Bolton was not loyal, the other noble houses were. All the noble houses of the North would become enemies of House Bolton at the same time. I'm doing this so I don't look like an unscrupulous tyrant. At least for now, I must be a benevolent king full of justice. Einar commented with a bored tone. He had invaded the Dreadfort using the voice and succeeded easily. There were few humans with enough mental stamina to shake off his influence. In the future, I really will be a tyrant, but I'll be a tyrant for the good of humanity. Einar knew very well how hypocritical, crazy, and insane his words were. But in the end, humanity would only achieve greatness when it was totally unified. And for that, only a tyrant god could control the most volatile beings in the known universe. Roos no longer wanted to hear Einar's words. The boy was mad and a sorcerer for controlling him using the voice. However, under his desperate eyes, letter after letter was written, all sealed with red wax and the coat of arms of House Bolton. With each letter written, he felt as if a sword was being driven through his heart. I don't usually like killing people, but what I'm going to do to your noble house, I'm going to enjoy. I'll take pleasure in reducing every atom of your castle to ashes. Einar spoke with a smile on his face. And when it's all over, everything that remains of House Bolton will be erased. I'll make sure no one remembers what House Bolton was. Einar knew how to strike terror into someone, especially a lord of a noble house, who had always been obsessed with ensuring the continuity of his lineage above anything else. Einar's words aroused anger, fear, and resentment in Roos. All these emotions were reflected in the Dreadfort Lord's eyes, which took on a furious look, with red veins clearly visible in the scara. I can feel your anger, but blame yourself for belonging to a noble house that I abhor with all my might. Einar spoke as he poured himself another glass of wine. He really liked that slightly spicy wine. It was perfect for drinking in the cold. Order the letters to be sent and go back to the office. I'll have you killed by sticking a sword through your heart. Einar ordered, using the voice. He didn't hide Roos's fate, only intensifying the Lord of Dreadfort's fear and terror. Roos's body obeyed, even against his will. Watching Roos leave his own office, Einar sat down in the seat that had belonged to all the Red Kings and Lords of the Dreadfort before. After killing Roos, he would find Ramsay and burn the entire Dreadfort before him, finally destroying the young man's last hope of revenge. Call him a sadist, but he thought that would be a pleasant fate for a monster like Ramsay. Seeing Roos return to the office with a terrified expression, Einar smiled and drew Lady Laia from her scabbard. The sword came out with a slashing sound, resounding off the walls of the office. The milky-colored blade seemed to glow, even without the sun's rays falling on it. Approaching Roose, despite the man's terrified look, Einar spoke with a cold tone. "Go to hell safely, Lord Bolton." Without any hesitation, the sword pierced Roose's heart. To add to his suffering, Einar slowly plunged the blade into his chest, in no hurry to kill the Lord of the Dreadfort. He enjoyed seeing the fear and terror in the man's eyes. The same look that Roose's victims gave him during the skinning process. The same look of fear and terror that the women this man raped showed during the brutal act. For this reason, Einar felt no pity for such human scum. It even increased their suffering. Einar then gently helped the Lord of the Dreadfort to his seat. Blood dripped from Roose's mouth, while the light from his eyes gradually faded, as did the last breath from his lungs. Even in the final moments of his life, he couldn't understand how he had offended someone so powerful. Looking at the lifeless body of the great Lord of the Dreadfort, with a wound in his chest and blood dripping from his mouth, Einar felt nothing but indifference. There was no special feeling in killing the descendant of the Red Kings of the North. "Let's go to the second stage of the theater," Einar muttered as he pulled Lady Laia from the chest of Roose's dead body and sheathed his sword again. Leaving Roose's office, Einar walked calmly through the corridors of the Dreadfort as if he were the master of the castle. If anyone saw him, they would think he was the owner, for he walked with confidence and firm steps. Einar stopped in front of a door after walking for a few minutes. It was Ramsay's room, the bastard's new bedroom after Domeric died. He had received this information from one of the servants, who had kindly offered it to him. Opening the door, Einar saw a luxurious room by medieval standards, and in the center, a bed with black sheets could be seen. In it, a young man with a terrifying face was sleeping peacefully. It was Ramsay. The young man was doped up on the wine served by one of the servants. Einar wanted Ramsay to wake up at the right time to enjoy the show. Looking at Ramsay sleeping, Einar didn't rush to wake the sleeping beauty. He sat in the chair next to the bed and sipped his wine with a leisurely expression. After destroying the Dreadfort, he would have to return to Winterfell and await the arrival of the Lords of the North. At that moment, Einar could imagine how much those brutish, brainless lords would try to challenge him, something he would gladly accept. After all, he needed something to de-stress, and beating up stupid people was a great relief. Turning his gaze to Ramsay's sleeping face, Einar's lips curved into a smile tinged with a touch of coldness. He was really looking forward to seeing the rapist's expression when he woke up and saw him at his bedside. But at the same time, he didn't want to wait too long. He wanted to get back to Winterfell as soon as possible and wait for news of the ruins of the Dreadfort to spread. That wouldn't take long. Ravens were surprisingly quick in their missions to deliver letters. Einar raised the goblet above Ramsay and swirled it around, pouring the entire contents into the bastard's face. The wet, suffocating sensation woke him up in an instant. Just as Ramsay was about to shout angrily at whoever had woken him up like that, he looked up and saw a pair of purple eyes staring coldly at him. The expression of fury on his face hardened. Absolute terror was reflected in his disfigured, grotesque face. However, all doubts, anger, and resentment were swept aside when he pulled a knife from under his pillow and attacked Einar without any hesitation. "Good morning, sleeping beauty," Einar commented in an amused tone as he calmly deflected the knife blows. Ramsay looked like an animal full of rage, brandishing the blade in all directions. None of the blows even came close to hitting the Dragon Prince. Einar tired of dodging and with one swift blow, punched Ramsay in the stomach, making the young man clutch his stomach and take a deep breath. He fell to his knees, gasping violently as saliva mixed with blood dripped from his mouth. Einar's blow had not been light, he had used a lot of force. Although the water of life hadn't strengthened his body, the immaterium dimension had. A strong body was needed to resist the deadly radiation of the warp's energy. Still kneeling, Ramsay looked at Einar with a look like that of a wounded animal. But unlike someone who would feel sorry for having stepped on a dog or cat's ass, Einar felt nothing but sadistic pleasure at seeing him like this. Grabbing Ramsay by the hair, Einar dragged the young man out of the room. Ramsay tried to struggle, but no matter how much he struggled, fought, or bit, the hand holding his hair seemed to be made of steel. "Let me go, you filthy bastard. You piece of shit. I'm the Dreadfort heir, and you're just a bastard. You can't kill me. Only the King and Lord Stark can sentence me to death." "Guards! Guards! Guardsis! Ramsay cursed, struggled and shouted at the top of his voice for everyone to hear, but his desperation only grew when he saw the guards of House Bolton on either side of the corridor, standing erect and majestic. However, everyone's eyes were cold and indifferent. The guards didn't even look at Ramsay. They stood erect and still, all holding swords as if they were performing a sacred task. Dragging Ramsay shirtless across the cold northern earth, Enar stepped out of the Dreadfort and released the bastard, letting him fall to the ground. Ramsay didn't move, not by choice, but he found himself unable to do so because Enar's foot was on his neck, preventing him from getting up or even moving, which made him unable to take his eyes off the ancestral castle of House Bolton. His face was pressed into the cold, wet earth of the north. "I killed your father before I met you," Enar commented with an amused tone. "Congratulations on becoming Lord of the Dreadfort." Ramsay's eyes widened at his words. His father was gone, and as the law of inheritance dictated, the heir designated by the Lord should take over the running of the noble house. However, Ramsay wasn't happy at all. On the contrary, there was only terror bubbling in his chest. If Jon had killed Roose, would he hesitate to kill him, a bastard? Caraxes, Dracarys. Ramsay heard Jon speak again, this time in a language he didn't know. He didn't understand what Jon had said, but he would understand in the next instant. Ramsay, who was pressed against the earth, felt tremors approaching and soon a deafening flapping of wings sounded, along with the snow being thrown up. Ramsay's pale eyes widened at the sight of the huge winged creature flying over the Dreadfort. Then the color crimson filled the vision of the bastard heir of House Bolton. "Nu!" A furious roar came out of Ramsay's mouth as he watched his hopes being burned away by the crimson flames. The Dreadfort was the only way for him to realize his ambitions and carry out his revenge. But in front of him, his hope was melting relentlessly in the crimson flames. "Why? What have I done to you?" Ramsay asked with a lifeless look on his face, his voice hoarse and trembling. "I have a plan, and that plan has to be exactly as I want it. I needed to burn down a castle to make the Northern Lords more tame, and you were chosen." Enar replied with an amused tone. "You'll be the reason most people bend the knee to me. Aren't you honored to have such a worthy mission?" "Go to hell, Ramsay Snow." Enar spoke calmly as he drew out Lady Lya. "I'll see you in hell if fate ever allows it, and I'll kill you again." He spoke with a cold tone as he cut off Ramsay's head with one swift blow. The Dreadfort bastard's head separated from his body and blood gushed out onto the snow. With Ramsay's death, the line of the Red Kings of House Bolton was officially extinct. In the last moment of his life, Ramsay shuddered to hear Enar's words. He thought he was cruel, but the young man pressing his face against the cold earth was a true demon. He admitted that he was a lesser evil, but Jon was the greater evil. Holding Ramsay's head, Enar looked at the ruins of the Dreadfort, still consumed by red flames, and nodded satisfied. He had killed all the guards of House Bolton for obvious reasons. The only people he had ordered out of the castle were the women who had been forced to practically become sex slaves. What he saw in the dungeons of the Dreadfort would stay with him for the rest of his life. There were monsters, and there were real monsters. The entire House of Bolton was a cancer that he had long wanted to eradicate from the face of the beautiful planet he would come to rule. With a crash, Caraxes landed next to Enar, kicking up huge amounts of snow. The dragon's neck curved around its rider, unconsciously protecting him. "Thanks for the hard work, Caraxes," Enar thanked his partner with a satisfied smile, displaying Ramsay Snow's head. He would take the head back to Winterfell, as it was Ramsay who would take the blame for the letters sent. Enar would only add that the bastard had killed Domeric and his own father to inherit the position of Lord of the Dreadfort. If it were with another noble house, perhaps many would be suspicious of his words, but not with House Bolton, which already had a terrible reputation, worse even than House Frey in Riverrun. Still holding Ramsay's head, Enar mounted Carax's saddle. Looking once more at the ruined castle, its stones twisted, melted, charred and scorched, he let out a sigh. The Crimson Dragon took a few steps forward and then took to the sky. With a loud, powerful roar, Caraxes landed outside Winterfell. The castle had no room for a dragon of his size. However, like any dragon, Caraxes loved digging holes to find the warmest places in the bowels of the earth and warm himself. So, outside Winterfell, There was a huge hole that could easily be mistaken for a gigantic well. Seeing the dragon settle into its makeshift cave, Einar decided to let his uncle deal with it. After all, Winterfell wasn't his to worry about. Still holding Ramsay's head, Einar entered the castle under the fearful gaze of the guards. No one stopped him or even dared to say anything. Everyone just made way for him. In the castle training grounds. "Why are you holding a head?" Robb, on seeing Einar enter the training ground, was shocked to discover that his brother was carrying a decapitated head by its hair. However, he put that aside when he remembered the letter that Lord Medger, of House Serwyn, had personally delivered to his father. A letter sent by the Lord of the Dreadfort, Roose Bolton. Lord Medger's poor horse had died of exhaustion on arrival, demonstrating how quickly he had traveled to Winterfell. Remembering the words written in the letter, Robb's face turned as cold as the northern winter. If before he hadn't had a good impression of House Lannister, now he felt a deep disgust. He really wanted to march into Lannisport and burn that city to the ground. Robb told Einar everything, and he nodded in satisfaction. Lord Medger was really fast. A journey that would normally take half a day took only a few hours. "Let's go to the Great Hall together. I have some things to explain to Lord Stark," said Einar, still holding Ramsay's head, as he walked towards the Great Hall. Robb nodded and, although curious about his head, followed Einar. As soon as they both entered the Great Hall, they heard the roar of an angry man. "Lord Stark, call up your banners. Let's march towards the Dreadfort and cut off Roose Bolton's damn head." Eddard Stark, sitting in the seat of the Kings of Winter, also had a particularly cold expression. If Robb was furious, the Guardian of the North was even more so. However, before he could speak, he heard his nephew's voice. "There's no need to march to the Dreadfort." Einar paused before continuing. "Roose Bolton is dead, and House Bolton has ceased to exist, as has the Dreadfort, which is now nothing more than a pile of molten rock." Whether it was Roderick Castle, Robb, Eddard Stark, or Medger Serwyn, everyone was stunned by Einar's words. After all, the extinction of a house was something extremely serious and rare to happen. Medger looked at the boy with the white gold hair and purple eyes with a perplexed expression. Remembering the rumors he had heard when he arrived in Winterfell, he realized that there might be some truth to those absurd stories. The mood of the Lord of House Serwyn couldn't have been more conflicted at that moment. He had heard from the Targaryen king like everyone else, especially after the Second Field of Fire, so to see the Targaryen king talking so friendly to Lord Stark left the Lord of Serwyn with mixed feelings of anger, confusion, and disbelief. "What happened, Your Grace?" Faced with a lord like Medger, Eddard addressed his nephew with formality. Roose Bolton's bastard Ramsay Snow, on Tywin Lannister's orders, murdered the heir to the Dreadfort, Domeric Bolton, and his own father in order to inherit titles and lands. I discovered the conspiracy, but I was too late. Everything had already happened. Einar lied without showing any expression to indicate that he was lying. Ramsay tried to attack me along with the guards of House Bolton. I fought back, and burned down the entire Dreadfort castle. Eddard stroked his own forehead as he listened to Einar's account. Did he believe his nephew's words? Absolutely not. He still remembered what Einar had said before he left and knew better than anyone that it was probably a lie, even though the letter he had read earlier was, in fact, true. In Eddard's eyes, there was no way his nephew could have controlled anyone or forced that letter to be written, even with a dragon in his possession. It would be a suicidal move, something no one in their right mind would dare to do. So he just assumed that Ramsay Snow had been blinded by greed, relying too much on Tywin Lannister's support. "Lord Stark, who might that be?" Medger asked, looking at Einar with typical northern distrust for foreigners. "Einar of Targaryen, first of his name, son of Prince Rhaegar of House Targaryen and my dear sister, Lady Lyanna of House Stark." Eddard presented Einar with a calm look. "Did you bend the knee to the Targaryens, Lord Stark?" Medger looked at Einar and showed a mixture of feelings in his gaze. "Yes," Eddard said as seriously as he could. But his father kidnapped and raped Medger didn't even have a chance to finish speaking. Leda, who had to arrive after sensing her king's arrival. She drew her sword and with a movement that was simply impossible for any normal human to follow, placed it dangerously close to the Lord of Serwyn's neck. "Lord Medger." Einar spoke, his voice so cold that it made the surrounding temperature drop dramatically. The Immaterium's energy subtly filled the room. "I won't cut off your head because you don't know the truth, but don't ever call my father a rapist again." Medjur felt a shiver run through his body. Those purple eyes really frightened him. In front of that intense gaze, he felt infinitesimally small. Eddard didn't have a pleasant expression, either when he heard the mention of his sister's rape. "My parents married, and I was born naturally. There was no kidnapping or rape. Certain people made up lies to destroy House Targaryen, and the whole continent became a plaything in their hands, including House Stark," Enar stated in a cold tone, his gaze fixed on Medjur. "My grandfather, Rickard Stark, was led to believe that my mother was in King's Landing, in the Red Keep. This led to his death and that of his son, Brandon Stark, my uncle." Eddard and Medjur's expressions were completely shocked by such an unexpected and insane revelation. "Who did it?" Eddard asked. His voice was calm, but inside he felt an uncontrollable desire to destroy everything and anyone responsible for this. "The Faith of the Seven and the Order of Maesters are the main culprits, but there were others like Hoster Tully." Enar answered without any hesitation. He wasn't lying when he said those words. House Targaryen had indeed fallen to the conspiracy of countless people and organizations, especially the Faith of the Seven and the Order of Maesters. Both organizations that didn't like House Targaryen at all. Hoster Tully wanted his blood on the Iron Throne to get Riverrun out of its predicament, so he married off his daughters to Lord Stark and Lord Arryn. But his plan failed when Jon Arryn and Eddard Stark refused to sit on the Iron Throne. The letter that reached Lord Rickard came from the hand of Lysa Tully. Although Catelyn was innocent in that respect, since she didn't know about the conspiracy, Enar added in a calm tone, his voice terribly cold and murderous. Eddard felt his chest tighten at the name of Hoster Tully and Lysa Tully. He wanted to laugh at the tragic situation, but no laughter came from his lips, only a deep bitterness in his heart. He had married the daughter of the man who had used the lives of his father and brother as pawns in a larger conspiracy. After 12 years of marriage, Eddard had obviously learned to love Catelyn, but he still felt as if he had been betrayed and was filled with rage. Robb opened his mouth and widened his eyes. He wanted to say something, but found himself unable to utter any words. He discovered that almost all of his relatives had either died because of conspiracies or were the conspirators themselves. He wondered why a throne was so important. "Uncle, I know you must be full of rage right now, but put that rage aside for a moment, and when I begin my reconquest, Hoster Tully's head is yours." Enar spoke with a calm tone. He too was angry, but he had to control himself. He was no mere mortal. His fury could have devastating consequences. Eddard regained his composure and nodded. However, he didn't know how he would look at his wife again. Although Catelyn was not to blame or aware of her father's conspiracy, he still felt extreme discomfort at the thought of marrying the daughter of the man who had killed his father and brother. "What do you want to do, Your Grace?" Eddard looked at his nephew with a seemingly calm gaze. He didn't doubt Enar's words. Although lies could be told, true anger and hatred could not be forged. If such a thing could be done by Enar, then Eddard had to regret that he had raised his nephew wrong. "Summon all vassals to Winterfell, all of whom must swear allegiance to me, bend the knee and accept my claim." When Enar said this, he was looking directly at Lord Medjur of House Serwyn. Medjur swallowed. He wasn't as stupid as the other lords of the north, but faced with Enar and that frightening look, the man preferred to kneel. "Your Grace, my sword and those of my vassals are at your disposal. I will fight for your causes and honor your laws in my fiefdom." Medjur knelt and swore allegiance to Enar without much reluctance. If his lord Eddard could forgive his nephew and fight alongside him, who was he to harbor a grudge against House Targaryen? Moreover, House Serwyn had suffered little in the war 12 years ago, which made his decision even easier. "I accept your oath, Lord Medjur of House Serwyn. There will always be a place for you on my hearth as a guest, and I will serve you bread and salt as the laws of hospitality dictate. I will never give you orders that tarnish the honor of your house or your descendants." Enar accepted Medjur's oath with a satisfied look, although he knew that things wouldn't be so easy with the other noble houses of the north. Especially Houses Dustin, House Ryswells, and House Glover. These three houses hold strong grudges against House Targaryen. The lords of House Dustin and House Riswells died in the Tower of Joy at the point of the same sword that Leda was holding at that moment. After watching the Lord of House Serwyn bend his knees before Enar, Eddard spoke in a calm, tired tone. "I'll send the ravens, but it should take 1 to 2 moons for them all to reach Winterfell." He himself would kneel to Enar at the right moment when all the lords and lattice of the north were present to help his nephew gain more allies without too much bloodshed. But knowing the customs of the north, he knew there would be bloodshed in the Great Hall, perhaps a few severed hands or even fingers. Eddard himself cut off some fingers of certain lords to make those northern lords stop arguing about who would lead the army 12 years ago. Enar nodded and wasn't surprised at the delay. The north was the largest kingdom in size. Even at war, it took a long time for the entire northern army to come together successfully. But Enar wouldn't stay in Winterfell all that time. He would stay at the wall and personally lead the arrival of the wildlings in the north. He wanted to be firmly in possession of the Horn of Winter. He never doubted that people could do crazy, insane things when they were angry. "I'll go to the wall. When all the lords of the north gather at Winterfell, send a raven to Castle Black," Enar said to Eddard. Of course, Eddard knew why Enar was going to the wall. The arrival of the wildlings in the north after thousands of years of hatred and blood. "Robb, you will accompany the king on the journey to the wall and act as my representative." Eddard spoke with a calm tone. He felt it was time for Robb to start seeing the world, and his son being at Enar's side would reassure him, something that shocked Robb. He never imagined that his father would allow him to leave Winterfell at this time, especially with war so close on the horizon. However, the heir of Winterfell had a big, excited smile on his lips. He would finally be out of this castle. Enar smiled too. He had originally thought that Eddard would send Roderick Castle as his representative, but unexpectedly the Lord of Winterfell had chosen his own son. "I won't bring dishonor to House Stark, father," Robb promised, beating his chest with a determined expression. Eddard smiled gently at his son. Although his marriage wasn't a bed of flowers at first, he couldn't be happier with so many sons and daughters. "I'll get ready." Robb spoke as he left extremely quickly, the news that he was about to leave surpassing even the news that his grandfather was a traitor and murderer, another grandfather and uncle of his. Or rather, he was using this trip to focus on something else, or he would start to hate his mother, something he didn't want to happen. Enar looked at Robb's back with a deep gaze. He could tell that although the heir of Winterfell was happy, there was a deep bitterness in his gaze. Rickard was also his grandfather, but Rickard Stark died at the hands of Aerys Targaryen, his grandfather. You could say that everyone killed everyone without any discretion. Whether it was Robb or Enar, they both had grandfathers who killed each other or conspired to kill. This affects people, especially those who valued family above all else. Like Robb and Eddard. The relationships and blood feuds of House Stark, Targaryen and Tully were really powerful and confusing. Letting out a sigh, Enar focused on Leda. The girl had grown a few centimeters in the short time he had been away. It was her period of rapid growth after the blood ceremony, I'll start calling it that, and the girl had probably eaten a lot of food. Leda stood next to Enar and showed a satisfied expression. She didn't like leaving her king alone, even with Caraxes to protect him. "I'll bathe and sleep, Lord Stark. I probably won't join you to break my fast at night." Enar spoke in a calm tone. He didn't feel like dining with other people and preferred the silence of his room with Leda. Eddard nodded. He himself hadn't planned to have dinner tonight. Now he just wanted to sleep and face a new day rested and without anger. He didn't want to do or say anything to Catelyn that would hurt her. "Lord Stark." Enar suddenly spoke, looking at Eddard with a deep gaze. "Lady Catelyn must not leave Winterfell for life. Should she disregard this order, I will consider her a traitor and cut off her head." Honestly, the only reason Catelyn wasn't dead was because she was her uncle's wife and the mother of his cousins. Otherwise, her fate would be similar to what will happen to Lisa Tull in the future. She will die in very painful ways, especially the current Lord Paramount of the Trident, Hoster Tully. Although Catelyn remained in exile in Winterfell, it was better than dying and the only concession he could make in respect for Eddard and Robb. Eddard looked gratefully at his nephew. He knew how much Enar hated his wife. And although Catelyn was a difficult person, she was a good mother and an excellent wife. Prince Enar. Just as Enar was ready to enter his room with Leda, he heard a young, delicate girl's voice. Looking down, he saw a red-haired girl with big blue eyes. "Sansa, you've grown up a lot. You're becoming more and more beautiful." Stroking Sansa's hair, Enar greeted the girl with a gentle smile. Unlike Arya, Sansa accepted his new identity with ease. The girl had really grown in the months he had been away. "I saw your dragon landing outside Winterfell. He's super giant." Sansa felt the caresses in her hair and smiled sweetly. She looked at Enar with her blue eyes and spoke with a tone full of admiration. "Well, Caraxes is really big." Enar replied with a laugh. However, remembering a fragment from the future, where there was a crimson dragon feeding on an entire planet, he thought that the current Caraxes was still a bit small. "Do you want me to take you flying?" Enar asked with an amused tone, his eyes looking at Sansa with a hint of teasing. Sansa's face turned pale at the mention of flying on a dragon. She quickly shook her head and denied it without any hesitation. "No. I'd rather stay on the ground, where I can feel safe." Enar wasn't surprised. In a world where people couldn't fly by plane, the fear of flying on a dragon was really great. In his past world, many people were afraid to fly, let alone in this medieval world. "Then let's go horseback riding another time, little redhead," Enar said amusedly as he entered his room with Leda. Sansa pouted when she saw Enar enter the room, but she wasn't disappointed. She knew he had just returned from a trip and was probably tired. Taking another look at his room, she left with lighter steps and a happy smile on her lips. Despite having changed her identity, she felt that Enar and Jon were the same person, only one was a bastard and the other a prince. But they both exuded a prince-like aura. "Your Grace is very popular with the women," Leda commented with a respectful tone as she helped Enar out of his clothes to bathe. Enar rolled his eyes. He was no fool and could see the look in Sansa's eyes, but he had no romantic feelings for her. She was his sister. But specifically, Sansa was his sister, without the Targaryen part involved. Enar couldn't help but laugh when he realized the difference in circumstances between Rhaenys and Sansa, but then again, he really only saw Sansa as a cute little sister who likes attention. "How's your power growth?" Dipping into the barrel containing hot water, Enar asked as he leaned his arms on the barrel. Leda helped Enar clean her hair and replied, "I can lift a horse with some difficulty. Run 100 meters in 5 seconds. My sword can cut through a tree trunk with one blow. Lightning manipulation is also growing. I can cover all 5 of my fingers with lightning." Enar couldn't help but show a satisfied smile. Leda's growth was greater than he had expected, which showed that his blood had become even more special after taking the water of life. "How was your conversation with Eddard? Enlightening or embarrassing?" Enar asked in an amused tone, betting on the second option, knowing Leda and Eddard's personalities. They were both generally thoughtful and quiet people. "Awkward," Leda replied with a touch of helplessness. "Talking to Eddard, even about something insignificant, was difficult. But I can see why my mother fell in love with him. He's a foolish and honorable man, which is rare." "You think being honorable is foolish?" Enar asked, eyes closed, enjoying Leda's hands on his hair. "If this were a peaceful world, being honorable would be a good thing. But after I saw a good man die at the hands of a thief, whom he himself helped, I realized that good people die early and bad people live longer." Leda replied in a calm, deep tone. "Do you wish me to be evil or honorable?" Enar whispered to Leda, with a deep look in her eyes. "A monarch should not be good or bad, but do what is necessary to bring peace to his people and kingdom." Leda replied with an indifferent tone. She knew that Enar was honorable, but the circumstances didn't allow him to act honorably, especially with the long night approaching. "The crown is a beautiful collar studded with precious stones." Enar laughed and spoke. Leda said nothing and continued to help Enar bathe. The night passed quietly, and the next day Enar was ready to start his journey to the wall. "Brother, you said you'd train with me," Arya commented with a sad tone, looking at Enar with her gray eyes. "I'm sorry, Arya, but I have important things to take care of at the wall." Enar stroked Arya's hair and apologized with a sincere tone. Although reluctant, Arya nodded. "Robb, do you want to go to the wall on a dragon or on horseback?" Enar turned to Robb, who was dressed dignifiedly in black clothes and a white wolf cape over his shoulders. Horse. Rob didn't hesitate to reply. There was no chance of him riding a dragon in his lifetime. Hearing this, Arya's eyes lit up with excitement. She glanced discreetly at the carriages bringing food and weapons, and a mysterious smile appeared on her lips. Einar rolled her eyes at Rob's cowardice, but said nothing, since the heir of Winterfell would be accompanied by more than 200 guards. "Then I'll see you at the wall." Einar spoke with a serious tone. He knew that these negotiations would be a headache. If the Northern Lords were considered hard-headed, the Wildlings earned the title of the most stubborn people in Westeros. Be careful and don't trust the Wildlings too much. Eddard advised his nephew in a serious tone. Not once or twice had he cut off the heads of Wildlings, and he knew exactly how they behaved. Einar nodded, but wasn't too worried. Apart from the cannibal tribes, he was confident of subduing all the other tribes and making them bend the knee. Taking his leave, Einar walked towards the exit of Winterfell, with Leda following behind him. Eddard looked at his daughter and couldn't help but speak. "Be careful, Leda." Leda stopped walking for a moment, but soon rejoined Einar, nodding in his direction. "Like father, like daughter." Einar murmured in an amused tone. Soon, under the eyes of everyone in Winterfell, the gigantic crimson dragon took to the skies, causing exclamation and shock. Even though it wasn't the first time they had seen Caraxes flying, the surprise was no less than the first time. Seeing that everyone was focused on the dragon's flight, Arya quickly snuck up and climbed onto one of the food carts, hiding behind a barrel crammed with preserved dried meat. "When I get back to Winterfell, I'll be grounded for eternity, but how can I miss such a rare opportunity to see the wall and watch the Wildlings bend the knee to Einar?" Arya murmured, with a glint in her eye, eager to see the scene that would probably be written about in the Westeros books. Robb and Eddard didn't notice Arya leave. The Lord of Winterfell looked at his heir and spoke with an emotional tone. "Be careful and stay by Einar's side. Don't hesitate to express your opinions, and if anyone causes trouble, cut someone's hand off first and then ask." Robb pursed his lips at his father's somewhat savage words, but nodded, showing a determined expression. Eddard watched his son accompanied by 200 guards with a slightly emotional look on his face. He was almost Robb's age when he went to war for the first time, and his son would unfortunately follow in his footsteps. "Don't worry, Robb. When I'm alive, you won't have to go to the battlefield." Eddard muttered with a determined look on his face. He also had to prepare for war, especially finishing the last touches on the Moat Cailin, making it a real war fortress. The closer he got to the wall, the more Einar could feel the cold intensifying. The temperature was significantly colder than the last time he was at the wall. At the same time, Einar could see things he couldn't see before, especially the war between the two gods above Westeros. In his eyes, the colors blue and red collided violently in the sky, like two different gigantic seas crashing into each other. Lawler and Great Other. Honestly, as the avatar of the omnipotent and omniscient god, the fact that Lawler couldn't kill this god meant many things, showing that Great Other was the avatar of a god of great power, just like the omnipotent and omniscient god. For someone who has read cosmic horror, Einar just hoped it wasn't an outer god. He already had to deal with the future gods of chaos. He didn't want to have to deal with another pantheon of gods full of madness and insanity. However, another thing that caught Einar's attention was the wall. To others, the wall looked like a gigantic wall of ice and snow, but to Einar's eyes, in addition to the structure itself, a white force field acted as a long curtain of light, going from the highest point of the wall and up as far as his vision could no longer reach. Einar saw that this was the reason why Silverwing hadn't crossed the wall during Queen Alysanne Ai's visit to the north. It was a barrier that prevented magical beings from leaving the far north. Although dragons could cross it, they would probably feel very uncomfortable. Under the snow that covered the wall, Einar also discovered hundreds of thousands of runes intricately carved into the seemingly eternal ice, runes that, strangely enough, drew power from a dimension he was getting to know very well, the Immaterium dimension. How exactly the runes of the first men were doing this, Einar had a certain idea, especially when he noticed the weirwood scattered all over the north. It was a brilliant idea to use trees that had an affinity to connect with the warp as continuous batteries to power the wall's runes. Although all the energy that came out of the warp and was carried by the weirwood was insignificant, even tiny, Enar had to admire the first men's boldness. What if the weirwood mutated as a result of the warp's energy? That was the concern that was worrying him enormously. The more Enar immersed himself in this dimension of seemingly infinite energy, the more he realized the terror that resided there was totally uncontrollable. He felt the gestation of entities beyond human comprehension, chaotic, insane, problematic beings. Gods of chaos. Although they were still in gestation, the birth of the chaos gods was inevitable. Humanity was still in its infancy, but when its population reached a critical number, the chaos gods would be born. And then Enar knew, the second true holy war would begin. True horror would descend upon the known universe. To face this conflict that would cover the entire universe, against races much older than humanity and even than the chaos gods, Enar saw only one way out: to unify the planet. Only through this absolute unity could humanity achieve a level of cohesion never before seen. Only united, focused on a single purpose, would they have a chance of winning. Castle Black Eamon was feeding the crows when he heard a guttural sound in the distance, accompanied by noises that resembled the flapping of a crow's wings, but infinitely louder, more powerful and more imposing. A smile appeared on the flabby lips of Mikar I Targaryen's son. He knew that his great-nephew had returned to Castle Black. And this time, riding Caraxes. He fully understood the implications of Enar's brazen actions. The prince no longer cared to be seen. War was drawing ever closer, and with it, the deaths of tens of thousands of people. However, he was confident that Enar would be a great king, even if he was the cause of the deaths of tens of thousands of lives. It wasn't just Aemon who heard the dragon's arrival. The entire Night's Watch looked up and in the distance, saw the gigantic crimson dragon flying through the gray skies, with snow falling all around it. The creature's vibrant color contrasted absurdly with the gray sky, making it impossible to ignore that winged hill flying above them. Jeor Mormont, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, watched the beast through the window and let out a helpless sigh. I just wanted to spend my last days in silence and peace. But here I am, embroiled in another war. Muttering to himself, he picked up his Valyrian steel sword, Long Claw, and left his office with a cold, determined look on his face. Outside Castle Black, Enar felt Caraxes land with a thud in the slightly deeper snow. Unbuckling the belt that held him and Leda in the saddle, he slid down the dragon's wing until his feet touched the ground. He looked at Castle Black and took a deep breath, while the woman next to him did the same, sliding down the wing lightly. Leda then looked up at Castle Black and frowned, disappointed by the sight in front of her. The fortress was nothing like the stories she had read when she was young. As well as being in a terrible state, it was now nothing more than a haven for thieves, murderers, and rapists. Thousands of years ago, the Night's Watch was much more than that. Many second and third sons of nobles, trained all their lives, chose to serve in that sacred order of watchmen, protecting the Seven Kingdoms from the threats coming from the other side of the wall. Nowadays, Castle Black couldn't even be considered an elite force in Westeros. Let's go. Still wearing his riding gloves, Enar commented, walking towards the gates with slow steps. When he realized that the gates weren't being opened, he let out a heavy sigh and raised his voice. Open the gates or I will reduce this place to ashes. You will be nothing but fertilizer for the soil, nourishing the new life with your own. Jeor recognized the familiar voice and for a brief moment, thought of the bastard of Winterfell. The voices were almost identical. Casting his doubts aside, the Lord Commander gave the order to his men, open the gates. The truth was that he had no choice. The dragon outside could turn Castle Black into ashes in a matter of minutes. To save what was left of the Night's Watch, Jeor made the most pragmatic decision. At the same time, he couldn't help wondering, why was the famous Prince Enar in the north? And even more so, what did he want at the wall? However, as soon as the gates opened, Jeor Mormont was speechless as he stared at the young man before him. His face, his posture, his gaze. It was impossible not to recognize him. Jon Snow? He asked in disbelief, his voice laden with confusion. But the young man only smiled serenely and corrected him, Enar Targaryen, first of his name. Enar stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the Lord Commander. Jon Snow was the name my uncle gave me to hide my true identity. Silence fell over the courtyard of Castle Black. Gior remained motionless for a moment, processing those words and gradually realizing their weight. Lord Stark really is a cunning man, he muttered, letting out a helpless sigh. Who would have thought that Eddard Stark's bastard was actually the rightful heir to the Iron Throne? If someone had told him this story before, he would have laughed. But now, faced with the imposing crimson dragon that could cover the sky with its wings and the young prince's unwavering gaze, Gior could only accept the reality being placed in front of him. "What is your purpose in the Night's Watch, Your Grace?" he asked, finally regaining control of his emotions. "Surely there are more important places for you to be." Yes, he could imagine that Enar should be seeking alliances right now and not at the wall. Enar gave him a sharp look before replying simply, "We'll talk more in private, Lord Commander." Without waiting for an answer, he advanced towards the castle. Leda followed close behind, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword. Her gray eyes rested for a moment on the Valyrian steel blade attached to the waist of the former Lord of the Bear Islands. She didn't underestimate Gior Mormont. Old though he was an experienced warrior. If the man had been in his prime, he would have been a troublesome opponent. Of course, that was before the blood ceremony. After listening to Enar's explanation of what was about to happen, Gior remained silent. On the one hand, there was the fight for humanity's survival. On the other, his responsibility as Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. In the end, being a cold and pragmatic man, he chose the obvious. "I've prepared Castle Black to receive the savages." Gior spoke with a bored tone, showing a slight touch of anger at the mention of the savages. For someone who had fought against them for many years, he never thought that one day he would be preparing negotiations with these people. "Thank you for being understanding, Lord Commander. We can't just let the others get another 100,000 almost immortal troops. Besides, with Mance holding the Horn of Winter, he would destroy the wall with his people." Enar was sincerely grateful to hear that Gior had agreed to the negotiations. When he announced that he would negotiate with the wildlings to get them into the north, most of the men of the Night's Watch would be outraged. Not because they didn't care about the survival of humanity, but because they had spent so long fighting the savages that they simply saw the act of breaking the oath as something completely unacceptable. "Does your grace think they'll bend the knee?" Gior asked in a calm tone. As someone who had fought against the savages for many years, he knew very well what they were like and how their society worked. The so-called free people was not just a title, but a way of life that had lasted for thousands of years. It wouldn't be easy to get the savages to let go of all their history and customs. Even if it meant surviving. Many people would rather die than betray their own traditions. Enar certainly knew what Gior was talking about. Looking into the eyes of the former Lord of Bear Island, he replied in a calm tone, "I gave them the chance to enter the north and mingle with our society. If they ignore my act of kindness, prepare to kill all the leaders of the tribes and Mance himself. It's better that they die by my hand than turn into white wanderers." Enar concluded, his voice cold and chilling. Gior flashed an equally icy smile as he listened to the Targaryen prince's cruel words. He hoped that the wildlings really would refuse Enar's offer. He had long wanted to decimate those arrogant enemies. "Your grace is truly a man of the north." Gior commented with a satisfied tone, appreciating the prince's determination and ruthlessness. Kindness, although valuable, was not enough for a king. He needed to be cruel when necessary, especially against enemies. Enar rolled his eyes. He didn't think that being a decisive man had anything to do with growing up in the north, but he said nothing and remained silent. Looking away, he saw his great-uncle watching him with completely blind eyes. Obviously, the man wasn't taking the potions with rabbit blood. "Our family is safe and reunited. Daenerys, Visenya, Rhaenys and Rhaella want to meet the old and powerful Aemon Targaryen," Enar said with an amused tone, noticing a smile appear on the old maester's lips. Gior looked at the old maester and couldn't help but smile too. It had been a long time since he had seen Aemon laugh as innocently as he did at that moment. He knew that the man was happy to know that his family still cared about him. At the same time, the old Lord of Bear Island couldn't help but miss his own family. By the way, Moonfire has bonded with Rhaenys. The two of them are inseparable partners. If it weren't for the dragon being too big to enter the room, the two of them would sleep together. Enar commented, making Eamon smile even more happily. Although he couldn't claim his own dragon, he was still pleased to see that beautiful silver creature with purple scales find a partner he could trust when the time was right. But Inar's next words made Eamon smile even more. Daenerys, your great niece, emerged from the fire intact, and with her, 3 dragons. Balerion, a small black dragon with reddish scales. He's quite arrogant and undisciplined. Syrax, a golden female dragon, so silent you wouldn't hear her flying. And lastly, Vermithor, a dragon with bronze scales and green eyes, the grumpiest of the brood. Eamon couldn't help thinking that this year of 294 was truly magical. So many things had happened that he felt he could finally die without worries. Knowing that House Targaryen was stronger than ever was comforting, and with Inar's efforts, he knew that the Targaryens would rule this entire planet for eternity, or until the universe was destroyed. At least that's what Inar had told him. Leda looked at the almost 100-year-old man with a curious gaze. After undergoing the baptism of blood, her king had told her that she could live for thousands of years without any difficulty. But living 100 years was still something she could never have imagined achieving in her lifetime. Thousands of years seemed too far away for her. At that moment, even a decade seemed like a long time, let alone thousands of years. Gior, Eamon and Inar talked about many things, mainly about the coming war, not the war of men, but the war against the others. All 3 were worried about this, especially Inar, who wanted to kill the Night King as soon as possible, although he knew that this wish would not come true so quickly. The evil gods would not let the war end so easily. Both sides would invest divine powers like never before. It could be said that the Night King was no different from a demigod after receiving so much power from the cold god. However, Inar discovered that these gods of evil didn't perform the long night just to satiate their desire to kill and destroy. Like him, all the gods could sense the immaterium dimension, and they all felt the gestation of the chaos gods. Even though they were gods, the gods of evil didn't want other gods to be above them. So the gods of evil decided on something simple, to prevent humanity from spreading indiscriminately in order to avoid the birth of the gods of chaos. That was the reason humanity had never advanced. Just as they were about to advance to the next stage of society's evolution, the gods of evil began the long night. The gods of good, who were on humanity's side, fought their enemies tooth and nail, and the planet's current system of power was thus established. Inar didn't have to fight the long night, but also the gods of evil, and even though they were preventing the birth of the gods of chaos, he didn't agree with the method. He would be the emperor of mankind. How could he see his people being killed indiscriminately? If the gods dared to touch humanity during his reign, he would kill every god and goddess in that damned pantheon if he had to. He would do even worse than Kratos did when he destroyed Olympus. He would cleanse the world of these filthy divine existences. As for the gods of good, Inar didn't quite know what to do with them. They had helped humanity and preserved the last spark of civilization in all the long nights that had happened. Otherwise, humanity would still be in the Stone Age. Is there a problem, Your Grace? Eamon couldn't see, but Gior noticed the cold, thoughtful expression of the young prince who would become king if he won the civil war, which he thought was quite likely Inar would win the war and become king. It wasn't that he didn't have confidence in Robert, but after seeing the Crimson Dragon, he really doubted that the dragon could be killed. It was more likely that the king and all his allies would be killed instead. It's okay, I just thought of certain annoying faces I want to kill. Inar certainly couldn't say that he was preparing to kill gods. He didn't want his allies to be frightened by such a terrible and frightening fact in the eyes of all the people on the planet. Gior looked at the young prince suspiciously. He noticed something deeper in Inar's words, but seeing that he didn't want to talk, the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch didn't ask any more. Mance looked at the wall, closer and closer, with a calm gaze. His brown eyes observed the dozens of leaders of the tribes of the Free Folk, including the last giants of the world known today. Honestly, the only reason he had accepted the negotiations was because the three-eyed raven had delivered the letter containing the terms. And he knew the negotiations wouldn't be easy or even smooth. Having personally seen the army of the living dead, he would give up his titles without any hesitation to survive what was to come. But the Free Folk were different. Many would rather die than bend the knee and betray ancient traditions. Behind Mance, miles away, hundreds of thousands of savages were camped out and slightly warmed up. Although the wall was indeed cold, in the far north it was 10 times worse. So much worse that a savage, even one with resistance to the cold, couldn't survive for more than a minute without clothes. The climate wasn't so severe, but with the arrival of the Night King, the far north became a place of death and cold. Not even the largest trees could survive. The sun's heat didn't seem to reach the far north, serving only to illuminate the day. "Are you sure they want to negotiate, Mance?" Speaking to Mance was a blonde, blue-eyed woman. Her beauty was almost legendary among the wildlings. Even in the south of Westeros, she could be mistaken for a real princess. She was Val, known as the Princess of the Wildlings. The woman had dark honey-blonde hair that reached down to her waist. Val had high, pointed cheekbones, and her eyes looked light gray or blue, depending on how the sunlight hit her face. She was slender, tall, and had full breasts. "Yes, they do, especially that Prince Enar." Mance replied in a cold, calm tone. Of that he had no doubt. He was in possession of the Horn of Winter and could destroy the wall whenever he wished. This was his greatest weapon and at the same time, his last resort, which he could only use in truly desperate situations. After all, although the Horn of Winter really could destroy the wall, what would happen then? He and his people would have to fight the Night King, the White Walkers, and an army of seemingly immortal whites without the protection of the wall. That was definitely bad news. "I hope you're right, Mance. We'll die if he decides to kill us." Val replied in an equally calm tone. "Don't worry. The Horn of Winter is with my wife. If I'm killed, she'll touch it and destroy the wall." Mance spoke with a cold tone. He might die, but he would take everyone with him to hell. Mance didn't realize it, but when he said it, a rat with icy blue eyes seemed to smile humanely. The rat quickly disappeared without anyone noticing its departure. Suddenly, a loud, thunderous roar resounded for dozens of kilometers. The savages' expressions changed dramatically, many displaying terror upon hearing the roar, which seemed to herald the end of the world. Then, as the sky darkened, everyone looked up and saw a sight they would probably never forget. A gigantic dragon was flying in circles above the wall. Even though they were miles away, they could still hear the flapping of the gigantic creature's wings. The perfect weapon to kill the Night King. Mance murmured with a slightly happy look on his face at the sight of the dragon. Half his worries had disappeared when he saw the creature. With a dragon that size, he had no doubt that the savage army would be no more than a slightly larger ant, which the dragon could exterminate with its flames. This confirmed that Enar really wanted to negotiate. Otherwise, the man wouldn't have had so much trouble getting him to the wall. He could very well cross it with the dragon and burn them until there was nothing left but ashes scattered over the deep snow. While everyone was staring dazedly at the dragon in the air, in a tree, among the foliage, a pair of golden-green eyes, similar to those of a cat, watched the creature in the sky with a fascinated look full of joy. Leaf couldn't help thinking that the Green Lord Seer was right. Her relative had brought the dragon back into the world, and with it, magic was gradually returning. She and all the children of the forest had noticed this phenomenon before, but didn't know its cause. With the return of magic, warp energy, Leaf and the children finally managed to resist the Night King's powers again, and got out of the passive situation in which they were just retreating. They dealt a great blow to those whites and White Walkers, teaching them a hard lesson with the green fire of life. Unfortunately, the magic had not yet fully recovered, and they were unable to conjure up a meteor shower as they had done thousands of years ago. Although Leaf didn't believe that the meteor shower could really kill the Night King, she felt that he was incredibly strong, already entering a realm that no other mortal could reach. A being close to divinity. For this reason, Brinden ordered Leaf and all the children of the forest to bow before Enar to help him in the fight to come. Leaf, as leader of the children and current queen of the children of the forest, was not against the idea of kneeling, but before doing so, she wanted to see the prince who was promised in person. And although she hadn't seen Enar yet, she could feel him even from miles away. There was no way not to feel that gigantic mass of chaotic magic overtaking the clouds. She estimated that even the Night King, thousands of kilometers away, could sense Prince Enar. Honestly, when she saw Enar's aura, she thought she was witnessing a god walking the earth again, after tens of thousands of years. It was such raw power that she couldn't help but want to get closer to Enar. As a being who felt close to magic, warp energy, being close to Enar was not unlike returning to the sea after so long. She estimated that the air around the prince was particularly pure. Leaf therefore had infinite expectations for her meeting with Prince Enar. "We're going to turn into dragon dung." Rattleshirt grumbled as he looked at the huge beast with a fearful gaze. Stop shaking with fear, your bones are rattling. Next to the Bone Lord, a red-haired girl spoke with a sarcastic and fearless tone. I'm not afraid. And watch your words, I'll cut out your tongue. Rattleshirt retorted to Ygritte's words with a slightly murderous tone. He hated being called by his nickname, and especially a coward. Ygritte showed no fear in the face of the threat and approached Val, looking at Rattleshirt with a sarcastic look, as if asking if he would dare do anything near the wild princess. Seeing the two start to fight again, Val looked at them both with a cold stare, and that was enough to silence the two voracious warriors of the Free Folk. Her gaze returned to the dragon, which was now perched on top of the wall, its huge red body reminding her of blood, a very obvious color in the white environment she was in at the moment. Val didn't know how a human could tame a beast like that. Even the mightiest ward couldn't come close to controlling such a powerful and magnificent creature. At the same time, she couldn't help but marvel at the wall. It was the first time she had seen the grandeur of the monument that killed millions of people just for blocking the way south. The same gate that had imprisoned the Free Folk for over a millennium was once again blocking their only chance of survival. Yet the irony of fate was that they had to depend on the wall to fight the Night King's seemingly endless army. And she had to admit, needing the help of the object that had always imprisoned them was a more than cruel fact. If possible, Val wanted to destroy the wall with the Horn of Winter, but she knew it would be suicide. Passing through the tunnel that led to Castle Black, Val noticed pairs of eyes staring at her with contempt and hostility. This didn't surprise her. If hatred could be easily forgotten, the world would have been at peace long ago. But hatred, like resentment, didn't disappear, it only grew stronger over time. The Free Folk and the Night's Watch could never be friends. They hated each other, even though there were exchanges on both sides. The closer he got to the end of the tunnel, the more blinding the light became, until he was through it and his vision gradually became accustomed to his surroundings again. When her eyes had adjusted, Val looked around and saw the members of the Night's Watch in elevated positions. They carried swords, but none wore bows, which eased her worries slightly. As for Castle Black, it was the first time she had seen such a large structure, and despite being in a terrible state, she still found the place majestic. She wondered if other castles were as big as the one she was in. However, her eyes soon settled on the chairs and tables set up in the center of the courtyard, obviously prepared for them. Then her blue gaze fell on the main table opposite the Free Folk. There, sitting in a larger and much more comfortable chair, was he. The color of his hair was something Val had never seen before, a mixture of gold and white, a very beautiful shade. His eyes were as striking as his hair, a shade of purple she had never seen on anything other than a cloth from a city called Mir, brought by Mance. As for his beauty, she had never seen a man, or rather a young man, so handsome. But she soon put these trivial thoughts aside when she saw him get up from his chair and walk over to them with a smile. Your Grace, it is an honor to finally meet the king beyond the wall. When the young man said this, the members of the Night's Watch let out a few mocking words, but Val realized that the young man himself had spoken with due respect to the king of the Free Folk. It is my honor to meet the father of dragons, Your Grace. Mance replied, as they both greeted each other cordially. Einar nodded and motioned for everyone to sit down. Food and wine have been prepared, you may eat at your leisure. Einar's gaze fell on the two giants with a helpless expression. As we didn't have any chairs or tables big enough for them, they'll have to sit on the floor anyway. Don't worry, as long as you serve them food and water, they'll feel that your grace is being cordial to them. Mance spoke in a calm tone. Aren't the food and wine poisoned? When Rattleshirt said this, silence hung around. All the eyes of the Night's Watch, including Gior's and Eamon's, showed expressions of anger. The law of the guest in Westeros was something sacred. Curiously, all the people who broke this ancient law died, almost like a punishment from the gods in the eyes of the people. Einar's smile remained the same. He took a glass of wine from the Free Folks' table and drank the entire contents without any hesitation. Don't worry about poison or anything like that. If I wanted to kill you, you'd already be dead. I don't need to use shameful means. He spoke with a courteous tone, but the coldness in his words made Rattleshirt feel a chill run through his body. I apologize for his words. We're very direct. Mance spoke, bringing the atmosphere back to calm, but but anyone could sense that the place was more tense than before. Inar's gaze fixed on the giants, more specifically on the two standing in front of him, Mag Mar Tundo Weg, known as Mag the Mighty, and One Weg One Dar One, known as One One. Under everyone's surprised gazes, instead of the common tongue, Inar spoke in the language of the giants, a language as old as the true tongue, spoken by the children of the forest. Welcome, great warriors. I am Inar Targaryen, king of the land you are in. Inar said to the two giants with a smile on his face as he handed them each a jug of wine. Little man, friend of the giants. One was the first to speak. His voice was slurred and slow, but incomparably powerful. He took the wine and drank without any hesitation. A single jug, which would have filled the glasses of 5 men, was emptied in one go. He had never drunk wine before, and when he tasted it, he found it incredibly delicious. The little man's drink is good. One commented with a loud laugh, which startled the night's watch. Mag also drank the wine and, like One, enjoyed the drink. Little man is the friend of giants. He repeated One's words, making Inar display a satisfied look. As for being called a little man, Inar didn't mind. At the moment, he really did consider himself a dwarf in the eyes of the giants, although that would change later. Your Grace can speak the language of the giants? Val exclaimed in shock. It wasn't just her. Everyone, including the members of the Night's Watch, looked at Inar with surprised expressions. I can speak even the true tongue. Inar commented in an amused tone when he saw everyone's reaction. Seeing the past and learning from it was really quite a broken skill. There was no language in this world, or in the future, that he couldn't speak. At Inar's words, everyone looked at the young man and was speechless, but soon sat down in their respective positions. As we know, the Night King exists and controls the White Walkers, along with an army of practically immortal whites. Taking a seat, Inar spoke, making everyone focus on him. You are migrating south because of this, and you must pass through the wall. Inar continued. I can grant you passage, but on 2 conditions. Kneel before me, and Mance must give up his titles and bow, as must his people. As Inar finished speaking, a tall red-haired man stood up, knocking on the table. I will never bow to a southerner, especially a boy who doesn't even have hair on his sack. Tormund shouted loudly, and everyone heard his words clearly. Leda, make Lord Tormund learn to keep quiet and wait for the others to finish. Inar ordered with a smile as he watched the show unfold before him. Tormund was surprised to see a delicate girl wearing white armor and wielding a sword. Noticing her intentions, he laughed out loud and spoke arrogantly. Do you think a pretty little girl wearing metal armor is going to intimidate me? I am Tormund, Mead King of Ruddy Hall, Speaker of the Gods and Father of Armies. He stood up from his chair and walked towards Leda with his impressive height of 2 meters. However, as soon as he had finished speaking, he felt the world spin, and in an instant, the sky appeared in his vision while a stabbing pain ran through his legs, almost as if they were broken. One of the Free Folk's greatest warriors had gone down without even being able to hit the enemy, or even see how she had moved. Feeling the cold tip of the sword against his throat, Tormund opened his mouth in shock, watching the cold gray eyes that stared at him with indifference. Don't interrupt my king again, or I'll cut off your head for this insolence. Leda said, looking at Tormund with a calm and impassive countenance. Tormund swallowed. He was a man of 2 meters, much heavier than any ordinary man, but now he was nothing more than a toy in the hands of the girl in front of him. How could that not be shocking? What did they feed you at birth? Giant's milk? Bear? Or maybe from the crimson beast above us? Sitting on the floor, he asked with a tone genuinely admiring of Leda's strength. I want to have babies with you. Our children will be big and monstrously strong. Tormund declared loudly, making Inar, who had been drinking wine, almost spit out his drink at the unexpected statement at such a tense moment. Leda looked at the man who was staring at her passionately and pursed her lips. Without even bothering to reply, she turned back from Inar, casting a cold, slightly murderous glance at Tormund. Tormund sat down again and said to Ygritte, who was standing next to him, Look at her. She's looking at me with such intensity. She must be thinking about the warm nights we're going to have and how many giant babies we're going to have. Ygritte looked at Tormund speechlessly. She was sure that the look on the girl in white armor's face was not one of love, but seeing the man's passionate expression, she knew that anything she said would be ignored. Your Grace is asking us to kneel, but what's in it for us? Mance ignored the whole situation with Tormund and Leda. His eyes were fixed on the prince's purple eyes. The people of the north won't take us in. We'll be treated worse than slaves. No, they won't even consider us human. We're just thinking beasts to the rest of Westeros. What Mance said made many look at their king with respect. Although the threat of the Night King was one of the reasons for everyone to accept Mance, a former Raven, as king, but Mance himself was the main reason. The man became one of them, and even married and had children. I will give you Sea Dragon Point and Stony Shore. I will leave them as your fiefdoms and for all the free folk. Enar spoke after a brief silence. Not only that. If you kneel before me, I'll give you enough food to last 6 months, and I'll help you build your towns and villages. For the next 10 years, the food you buy from Reach will be half price, until you can finally grow crops with the help of the Glass Gardens. Enar's words surprised all the members of the Free Folk. How could they know how many people they had? There were hundreds of thousands of mouths feeding all the time. At this very moment, of these 100,000 men and women, around 10 people were starving to death every day. Now, knowing that they could have a place and food moved the hearts of many of the Free Folk. Yes, although at first there was mistrust and hostility on the part of northerners like yourselves, they are a straightforward people and respect the strong. Enar continued. You just have to show that you're not man-eating monsters, and you'll gradually be accepted over the coming decades and hundreds of years. But all of this has to start with you taking the first steps to make something like this happen. Enar finished, looking directly into Mance's eyes. Looking into the young prince's sincere eyes, Mance breathed a sigh of relief. Enar's terms were 10 times more generous than he had expected. Honestly, he had only expected permission to cross the wall and submit, while his people gradually spread north. But not only had the prince promised him fiefdoms, he had already prepared food so that they could feed themselves for months without worrying about hunger killing their children. Not only that, being able to buy food from the Reach at half price for 10 years was more than enough for them to establish themselves in the north without many dying. Just as Mance was about to speak, a man he didn't like at all stood up and spoke in a deep, strong tone. I am Marlowen, leader of the Ice River clan tribe. Southern King, do you think you can rule us? We fight giants, mammoths, and beings you can't even imagine. My clan and I will not kneel to a boy. As soon as he had finished speaking, he spat on the ground. His stern face looked at Enar, without hiding his sarcasm. Leda was furious at his extremely insulting words and actions. She drew Dawn in an instant, and the sword shone in the sunlight, almost as if it were made of pure light. Watch your words, you filthy cannibal. I'll cut off your bloody head and feed it to the pigs along with your disgusting body. Leda spoke with an extremely cold and deadly tone. If it hadn't been for waiting for Enar's permission, she would have already gone ahead and brought the cannibal's head to him. Marlowen, right? Enar gestured for Leda to remain silent and stood up. If you think I'm weak or something, please draw your sword and step forward. But know that you will die. Enar stepped forward and stopped in the middle of the space between the two tables. The space measured about 10 meters, but it was enough for him to kill Marlowen without any difficulty. Drawing Lady Lya from her scabbard, Enar waited for the cannibal's response in silence, his eyes fixed on the green eyes of the leader of the Ice River cannibal clan. Marlowen, seeing that everyone was watching him, remained silent for a moment. But this silence only caused Tormund, who had been silent until then, to speak sarcastically and end up laughing. The great cannibal of the Ice River is afraid of a boy. Ha 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 ha. You'd better go back to your mother's teats, cannibal. She'll feed you meat from your brothers. Tormund's words caused all the free folk to burst out laughing. Aren't you going to use your crimson beast? Marlowen asked, pointing to the dragon perched on top of the wall. No need to worry, you're not worthy of being eaten by Caraxes. Enar replied with an extremely sincere tone, so sincere that it caused laughter on both sides. I've never eaten someone with your hair color. It must be delicious. Perhaps I could command the beast you call Caraxes. Marlowen spoke as he held up the spear made of bones. Very large bones, probably from a giant. The tip of the spear was made of steel, which was rare for the common people of Westeros and even rarer for the wildlings. Enar laughed at the cannibal's audacity. If it were so easy to steal the gift of a dragon bond, many bastards and descendants of the great dragonlord houses of Valyria would not have become irrelevant over the years. However, Enar looked at the cannibal walking towards him. The man had a cruel, sadistic smile on his lips. On his clothes, there were dozens of human ears, forming a vertical belt. Enar wasn't afraid of a mere cannibal. He would end the life of that human scum in an instant. What was about to happen could not be called a fight, but a massacre without resistance. Normally, Enar didn't use so much strength against mere humans. His body strength alone was equivalent to that of hundreds of men. Even in his future fight against Robert, he would only use the normal strength of a man, because he wanted a brutal and crazy fight with his cousin. But Marlowen naturally wouldn't have the privilege of such a protracted and epic fight. Enar needed to show his strength more than ever at that moment. Clenching Lady Lya's fist tightly, Enar stepped forward and under everyone's shocked gazes, his body accelerated at incredible speed. Marlowen didn't even manage to defend himself before his left leg separated from his body. The man only realized the loss of his limb when he overbalanced and fell to the hard ground, breaking his nose in the process. First, Enar shook the blood off the sword with one swift movement. Looking at the severed leg, he spoke with a sarcastic tone. "Don't run so fast, it's dangerous. You could fall." "You bastard!" Just as Marlowen was about to finish his sentence, his arm was ripped from his body with a spray of blood splashing onto the floor in an instant. Enar didn't stop. He cut off the cannibal's right leg and then his left arm. It all happened in the blink of an eye. The man had lost all 4 limbs, leaving only his head. Enar approached, pointing the tip of his sword at Marlowen's head, bringing the blade dangerously close. Looking down with an extremely cold gaze, Enar didn't even allow the man to say anything else. He lowered the sword, piercing his brain and killing him instantly. An ordinary human would never stand a chance against him, especially after drinking the water of life. A deafening silence hung in the air. That display of power could never belong to a mere human. But standing before them was a man who had surpassed the limits of humanity. "Does anyone else think I'm weak and can't fight the Night King?" Enar looked at the leaders of the Free Folk and asked calmly. His voice was cold and indifferent, very different from the warm and polite tone of before. And they had to admit, they would rather the king spoke to them again in his warm voice. The current one sent shivers through their bodies. Looking at Marlowen's butchered body, they all nodded in agreement. Who would be foolish enough to fight a monster like Enar? Especially after watching him sever a man's 4 limbs in less than 10 seconds.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.